Hello and welcome back to the Metroball Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. So we are halfway through our System Gateway review series. We are doing the criminal cards today. So we have 9 criminal cards to talk about and 3 neutrals we're going to append on the end. And if you're jumping just halfway through this review series to understand how this works, we're going to be going through all 12 cards today and taking some time to talk a bit about the cards, a bit about the flavor and lore behind them, and then most importantly, what sort of decks and strategies these cards work well with. Now, it's important to know a lot of new players are getting into Netrunner through System Gateway. Welcome. So we'll be talking about these cards specifically in that sort of meta of a limited card pool in System Gateway. But it's also worth noting that these cards are legal in the standard card pool, which is like the big Netrunner competitive card pool of the last 4 or 5 years. So we're going to be talking about these cards in both contexts. Hopefully we make it clear when we jump from one to the other, and hopefully there's something here for everybody. I think that's largely it. There's going to be timestamps in the video bar at the bottom. So if there's a certain card you want to jump into, go ahead and do that. And lastly, if you like this sort of content, it'd be great if you could like this video or subscribe to the channel. It really helps the Metroball Grid grow. Awesome. So for a lot of people who are new to Netrunner, I think a really nice way to start, like we have with the other review videos so far, is to talk a bit about what criminals are. And this is a little piece of text from the Nisei Learn to Play website. And I guess we'll do some story time and read what Nisei has to say about criminals. Some runners have learned that the only way to get ahead in the system is to step outside it. These criminals know better than to draw attention to their exploits, and so they work in the shadows, sneaking their way into corporate accounts, or they blend in, pretending to be a trusted friend in order to obtain the credentials they definitely should not have. Crims run because it's profitable. Whether it be by siphoning funds or selling corporate secrets to the highest bidder. As long as there's a profit to be made from running, criminals will continue to run. I think that's pretty succinct, and that last sentence is kind of largely all you need to know about criminals. It's important to know in Netrunner, the runner faction specifically, they're grouped up not by who they are, like some other kind of card or board games would do, but more about why they do the thing they do. So all the criminals are running because of greed, because it's profitable and there's something they can get out of it. And I think a really good place to start is the original Netrunner criminal identity, which was Gabriel Santiago. Very simple ability. The first time a turn you run HQ, gain 2 credits. And this is the basic ethos of the basic formula for how a lot of criminal cards work, which is make a run, get paid. And you'll see this pattern over and over again across a lot of the criminal cards. And it's a really strong and a really fun pattern in Netrunner. This is Los, Data Hijacker, make a run, the Corporate Dice, get 2 credits, get paid. Desperado, make as many runs as you want, get paid for all of them. If they're successful, bank job, make a run, pretend you're a Titan transnational employee, get paid. Security testing, make a run, get paid. Bravado, the modern, make a run and get paid. And again, this is a really fun way to play Netrunner. Running is my favorite part of Netrunner, and a lot of people it is as well. And being able to make money at the same time that you're running means you're going to be making more runs because it ensures you have the economy to continue to do the thing that you want to do and get a lot of accesses. And that's a really fun part of Criminal. It really encourages you to interact with the corp, which is exciting, especially that they made this profitable. It's also nice to know with the original 3 Netrunner factions, they each targeted a different central server. So Shapers, they put pressure on R&D. Anarchs are meant to put pressure on archives, and Criminals, they got HQ. So when you see a criminal runner, you're pretty sure that they're going to be putting some sort of pressure on HQ, and you're very likely to ice up HQ pretty quickly. This is HQ Interface, an old card that made those HQ runs a bit sweeter and criminal, but you saw Gabriel Santiago who runs HQ and gets 2 credits. So there's a lot of reasons why criminals want to be running HQ. Sninkder Beta has been around since the original core set. Again, HQ pressure is going to be coming from multiple angles, and there's just so many cards in the criminal card pool that say run HQ, if successful, do something good. And this is something that's actually missing from System Gateway. We have similar effects to legwork in System Gateway that say make a run on HQ if successful, just see more cards. But Criminal was classically more feared, not because of the HQ multi-axis, because of other abilities they had that said make a run on HQ if successful, do something else. This is a count siphon, and it's hard to under-express. It's hard to say how this card was absurdly good. It was a 0 credit run on HQ that caused a 15 credit swing, And this was in the original core set. It's no longer in the standard card pool, but so much of old criminal play for the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, a lot of it was just how many times could you deliver account siphons into HQ, which is wild. And this is what I was scared classically when playing against Criminal, is this sort of HQ pressure. Cards that say run on HQ, something happens. It's not so much accessing multiple cards, but an absurd amount of economic pressure. And while account siphon isn't in the standard card pool anymore, there's still a lot of cards that embody that sort of strong HQ pressure. We have Emergency Shutdown and System Update 2021 on a run on HQ. If successful, you can derez some of the corp's biggest ice, the most expensive ice. Cards like Embezzle are really fun, kind of bleeds into that Anarch ability of destruction, but run HQ, name something intelligently, gain 8 credits, watch them lose everything. And Steve Cambridge also has just come back into the standard card pool, and he's a really fun reason to run HQ. You got to get a card back from archives of the corp's choice, or maybe it's not even a choice. And this sort of HQ pressure is really, really fun. And I don't think it's entirely there in System Gateway. There's very few cards that interact with HQ. Admittedly, it is a small card pool, but that's very important to know about criminals, is they want to target HQ heavily. So there's a lot of reasons to ice that up. Now, we talked about criminals want to run for greed and for profit, and we talked mostly about that being economy, making credits. But that's not only, or it's a bit more wide than that. This is Nero Severn, who in the lore is an information broker. And there's a fair few criminal identities that deal more with information than they do with credits. Again, and information is a very valuable asset. It's a very valuable resource when it comes to Netrunner. And I think the modern one that really makes this obvious is 419, the immoral scammer. Very people have strong opinions about 419. Now, 419 forces the corp to pay extra money on installs unless you expose the piece of ice. And expose is something that's almost entirely within the criminal card pool right now. It's a very strong criminal sub-theme. And what expose is, because this doesn't exist in System Gateway, is the idea, because the corp installs all their cards face down, is that you get a look at a card. You can kind of just peek what it is and see what it is, remember that, and then it just goes back down onto the table where it was. And information is very valuable in the game of Netrunner, and there's a lot of criminal cards that deal with that sort of information gathering. Whether it's Silhouette, the old expose identity from Honor Prophet, and her console blackguard, which made expose into a very strong economic pressure card, or maybe it's a GPI net tap, a card that lets you expose ice on an approach. If it's something really scary, you can jack out in a panic. And it's worth noting that this card is actually banned right now in standard card pool. But if I want to say anything about expose right now, this is the modern expose card. It's falsified credentials. It's the criminal's tool to figure out what's in a remote server. And that's very, very valuable. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the only card in all of standard Netrunner that can do that, let alone get paid at the same time. So that sort of information is another thing that criminals can really leverage. On top of that, criminals are good at dealing with ice, but not in the way that some other factions are good with dealing with ice. They're not good at dealing with ice in the standard install breaker, boost strength, interface, break subroutines. They have a lot of other ways of dealing with ice, and on a more interesting way. And bypass is one of the big themes here. This is Femme Fatale, a huge, expensive program that when installed, you get to put its kiss on one certain piece of ice. And instead of dealing with the whole, program breaking cost thing, you can just pay 1 credit per subroutine to bypass that piece of ice. You just kind of jump over it. That's incredibly valuable. Not a lot of factions have that sort of ability. Again, I think bypass is also almost specifically a criminal thing. You have Abagnale as well, a decoder that in a panic, you can always bail and bypass that, fly through that toll booth if you really need to. But I think the big card that represents criminal bypass is Inside Job. A simple run event that just says the first piece of ice, I'm going to hop over it. And it's not the first piece of ice approached, first piece of ice res. So it puts a lot of pressure on criminals. And while this isn't exactly bypass, this is the modern, this sees a lot more play modernly. This is Boomerang. And it's the same sort of idea of a solution to a single piece of ice outside of the program and credits situation. And Inside Job and Boomerang, I think, are a really big deal, because you might learn quickly when playing against criminals in the standard card pool is that you can't score agendas behind a single piece of ice, because they do have some strong pressure with Inside Job or Boomerang. You don't see Femme Fatale so much. Now, another interesting thing that they have going on, and I think this might be exclusively in the criminal card pool, again, part of my lack of research maybe, is the ability of de-resing ice. This is Peregrine, and there's a whole cast of Falcons that work similarly. The idea is that if you pay this wild cost, you can de-res a corpse piece of ice. So if they went out of the way and spent 7 or 8 credits for a big piece of ice, you can say no and derez it. And so later in the game, they can res it. And we do see derez, mind you, in System Gateway, but this is a very criminal thing as well. It's one of their mean ways to deal with ice. Bachlan Botchkin was printed in Downfall, a derez card. And we also have Earth's Rubicon Switch, excuse me, I almost said Earth Scion, which is a derez hardware on a stick. So there's a lot of pressure here. And I'm just going to wrap that up with the idea of pressure. And I think derezing really plays into the suite is that we don't have a count siphon, that sort of 15 credit wild card that we talked about before, but modernly we have diversion of funds. And the idea is that criminals are really strong at putting pressure on, economic pressure onto the corp. Cards like diversion of funds, run HQ, that can be a 10 credit swing. And then if the corp doesn't have money, they can't do anything. If you can leverage, now, if the corp doesn't have money, you can start making more runs, get more paid. If you derez their ice, they're even further behind. And this sort of pressure is something that's very criminal, making a lot of runs and making sure the corp isn't in the best, or it doesn't always feel like they're in control. They can't jam out early in remote servers because you have access to things like Inside Job and Boomerang. They have to protect HQ to stop things like diversion of funds. And this is quintessentially criminal. I also want to point out Corporate Grant, which was another really strong economic pressure card. This card, mind you, isn't legal in the standard card pool. All currents are currently banned, but that's a big part of what criminals used to do. Pressure HQ, slow down the game, steal some money, and then bypass through some ice if the corp is going maybe a bit too fast. And that's criminals. That's my criminal recap at this point. I find them to be, again, really, really fun to play because they're generally very good at producing credits and they're very interaction heavy. A lot of their things require runs. Now, as a corporation, if you're against a criminal, icing HQ is generally a really good thing to do to stop any of these really strong effects from happening too soon or without any sort of, it slows the runner down. And one of the best things you can do is make sure that running is not as easy as possible. Putting some ice up, multiple pieces of ice on central servers, you can really slow them down. So that's what criminal is. Let's talk about what criminal looks like specifically in System Gateway. And what a place to start. Then with our ID, we have Zahya Sadeghi, the versatile smuggler. She has no link. She's a cyborg identity that actually doesn't mean anything modernly. And her ability reads, whenever a run on HQ or R&D ends, you may gain a credit for each time you access the card during that run. Use this ability only once per turn. And her flavor text says, I obtain your desire. It's a 40 minimum deck size, full 15 influence, just like all of the identities within System Gateway. So if you want to know a bit more about Zahya Sadeghi, there's actually like a really good flavor lore article on the Nisei website called Deliverance by Ian F. This was put up just the day when Zahya was first revealed back in, I think it was March at the time, maybe February. And do check it out. It talks about her kind of balancing her professional life, her criminal life, her home life. And it's actually a really good read. So this is Zahya, and Zahya falls into that criminal category perfectly. Make a run, get paid. So at the basic, with no other card support, once per turn, if you run R&D or you run HQ, you access a card, you're going to get a credit. And that's not bad at all. This is basically a reimagining of Gabriel Santiago, the original core set identity. And I used to love teaching people how to play Netrunner. I would always set them up with Gabe as their identity. And it's because Gabe is, again, very interaction heavy. And Gabe also gives you a very clear goal of what to do every turn. Run HQ, force a res, make sure that the corp is spending money resing ice, get into HQ, get paid. And Zahya she's like Gabe. Obviously 2 credits is more than 1 credit, but she also allows you to put pressure onto R&D. So the idea is you put pressure on 2 central servers in the early game. You force the corp to ice up HQ and to ice up R&D. Otherwise, you're going to get in, get credits and accesses, and that's quite good. It's really interesting too. It's very generous. This is one of the very few criminal cards that says the word R&D on it and interacts with R&D in like a pretty reasonable way or a meaningful way, right? There's very few of these cards. I think it's only like MU Safecracker up here and Spy Camera. I don't count Mobius. That's actually a misprint from what we understand. But that's kind of wild that this sort of identity of criminals pressuring just central servers in general is alive and well in Gateway. And that's kind of a new thing. So Zahya's great. Again, and this is such a big thing. We've talked about this a heck of a lot when it comes to learning Netrunner. One of the best things you can do is just run. It's important to make sure that the corp is spending money, resing ice, and keeping you out. If you wait for your breakers and if you wait for yourself, if you wait to install your breakers and get your money up and then say, I'm ready to run, at that point, it might be too late. You've let the corp sit back and set up and get their money and play their econ cards that require them to already have econ, and you're not forcing them to do anything. And one of the best things you can do, click one, a lot of times if they ice up HQ, is just run HQ. You're going to spend money. You're going to take, I don't know, sometimes you just end the run. Sometimes you take like 2 net damage. You'll be fine. And if they don't res ice, you're going to get in, you're going to get an access, and you're going to get a credit. And I really like that. That's a lot of value for a single run. You get economy, which is a bit light on the ground in System Gateway, and you also get accesses. And you need a certain amount of accesses in Netrunner to win the game. And even if you don't get an agenda, you get some information and you start to understand what the next couple turns are going to look like. That's really fantastic. That on its own, it's a good ability. It's going to fire a couple times, but one of the big things about this card, it says whenever you make a run on HQ and RD, gain a credit for each time you accessed a card. So the idea is that you can access multiple cards. There's only a couple ways. There's 3 ways right now in System Gateway to access multiple cards. And again, we talked about how R&D pressure is so wild. If, say, turn 1, the corporation only ices up HQ. Okay, actually, imagine this. They ice up HQ, they ice up R&D, they take a credit. So again, I think one of the first things you should do is just run HQ. And now the corp has a pretty good reason why to spend money resing ice. So maybe they go out their way and spend most of their money resing some piece of ice on HQ. And now you've ended the run and the corp is now down on 1 credit. And this is why pressure is so important. If the corp is down on 1 credit, what can they do next turn? Nothing besides click for credits. And then on top of that, they probably can't res the ice that they put on R&D. And this is why Jailbreak is just such immense value in Zahya. And we'll be talking more about Jailbreak later in this video. But the idea is that you run run R&D now, gain a credit. Excuse me. You run R&D, get a card, see 2 cards at the top of R&D, gain 2 credits. Again, because Zahya can get money for each card she accesses. And you probably want to play all the multi-access you can in a Zahya deck in System Gateway. We're going to be talking about Docklands Pass after, but Docklands Pass is very good. The idea is that your first HQ run a turn is no longer 1 credit, it's 2 credits and 2 cards. You're like a better Gabe at this point. And you also do have multi-access with on R&D if you want to play this. And I would argue that in every System Gateway deck, you probably want at least a single copy of Conduit, just so that if they don't deal with this and don't purge this, you can run R&D, see 4 cards, gain 4 credits, and that's wild. So you want to run. And you want to run often in System Gateway to make sure you're getting your Zahya value. And so you want to build a deck that gets a lot of value from running and can run really cheaply. So I think you want to consider your Breaker Suite. We talked a lot about code gates so far in System Gateway. I'm a big fan of Buzzsaw because it deals with all the code gates really, really well in System Gateway. So get a Buzzsaw down, start smashing into R&D or into HQ. Get a leech down. And this is the sort of idea is that if you can make money from running, there's so many other cards in System Gateway that can give you additional value from running. We'll be talking about all of them because a lot of them are criminal cards, but you put them all in a deck. It's very easy for Zahya to run HQ, gain like 3 credits and gain a leech counter. And it's an immense amount of value. And I think that's really important. Now, one thing about Zahya that's worth noting is that she gains her credits once the run is over. And that's actually a bit different than some of the abilities we've seen before. Gabriel Santiago gave you the money at the beginning of the run. So when the run was declared successful. So if you actually accessed HQ, you could use the Gabriel Santiago money to trash a Nico campaign. And Zahya is definitely a bit different here because if you run HQ and you can't use the money right away, you're going to get it after the run ends. So it's worth keeping that in mind in terms of the timing. I have no doubt that can be goofed up. That's Zahya. And again, like there's a lot of cards within the criminal card pool that interact really favorably with Zahya, especially just the idea of running, getting accesses, being aggressive. All of this like plays really well together. We'll be talking about those other cards in a moment, but Zahya represents early aggression. She gives you money and refunds money on runs at least once a turn on R&D or HQ. And you want to play some multi-access, and multi-access is good. Seeing more cards when you're running HQ and R&D is one of the best things you can do in System Gateway when running HQ and R&D. She's great. She's really interesting in Gateway. I feel like Lu represents aggression and destruction, and Tao represents some wild potential pressure and some really interesting, galaxy brain plays. And Zahya is just kind of good stuff fuel. She's just going to continue to fuel you to do the thing that you wanted to do anyways, and it feels good to play. Play a Zahya game and watch how much money you get. And again, if you're playing Zahya, maybe I recommend her try to play a bit more aggressively than you might be used to force the corp to spend money, to deny you money, and then your ability is triggering more often. And I'm a big fan of Zahya. I think Zahya is a really fun to play in System Gateway. And I think out of all 3 identities, she is the one after the neutral identities that they teach you to play the game with that I would recommend players to learn. Now, the question is, when you go to a bigger card pool, when you go to standard card pool, how does Zahya fare? And one of the cool things about going to a bigger card pool is that there's more cards that interact directly with Zahya's ability by running HQ and R&D and seeing multiple cards. Now you have legwork, and legwork costs 2, but it'll refund you 3 credits. So you can run HQ, see a bunch more cards, and get paid for it. And the same idea goes for Maker's Eye. You can run R&D, see 3 cards, gain 3 credits. And honestly, legwork to some extent doesn't feel that much better than Jailbreak. I'd argue Jailbreak is just a stronger economy card. It also draws you card. Now you are trading off 1 extra card, whether it be legwork or Maker's Eye. And I'm interested to see what Zahya decks do in the standard card pool. But I'd actually be more likely to play Jailbreak in my Zahya deck before legwork or Maker's Eye, especially because we also have hardware, and we'll get to that in a second. Now there's other ways to see multiple cards off of R&D in standard. We have things like Nyashia or Exer or Neutralize all threat from HQ. And I'd argue that none of these cards are generally worth pursuing. They're a bit fiddly and they cost a fair bit of influence. But I think the one big multi-axis card that you do want to spend a bit of influence on in Zahya is Turning Wheel. And Turning Wheel is so strong. The idea with Turning Wheel is you get it down, hopefully early, and every single run that you make, if you don't steal an agenda, even if the run is not successful on R&D or HQ, even if the run ends, you get a counter in the Turning Wheel. And it can be very easy for the mid to late game that you can run HQ, spend 10 counters and see all of HQ, and with Zahya make 5 credits. That's actually a really generous thing about Zahya specifically, is she doesn't trigger the first time a turn you access HQ and R&D. It is your choice. So you could run HQ with a Turning Wheel, get some counters, get some counters, get some counters, and then finally make one big run on, say, R&D, and then cash out and gain your, I don't know, like 4 or 5 credits. And that's really nice. It lets you set that up. Also, an interesting thing is that you can trigger this ability after you see the card. So I imagine there's actually some times where you run R&D and on the top you see something like a hard-hitting news and think like, oh, my money is maybe not as good as I thought it would be. So I'm actually just going to take the credit here and not run HQ later on in the turn. And that's actually quite generous. The idea is that you can look at all the cards that you've seen in central servers and then decide, is that my Zahya money or am I going to continue to run? And that can help you. That's actually really nice that you don't have to declare it at the start of the run or the start of the access step. Now, also in standard, you do have access to Conduit, and maybe you can make Conduit a bit more aggressive if you combine it with Contaminate. So with this 2-card combo, you can suddenly start accessing 3-4 cards off of R&D very quickly. And Contaminate doesn't seem the worst when you have Amakua in the standard format, which is quite nice. Now, a really interesting interaction, Crisium Grid. Well, it's not specifically Crisium Grid here, and Crisium Grid shows up a lot whenever you play a criminal deck. It just happens to you, right? Is that Zahya actually gives you credits for every time you access a card when you run HQ and R&D. So if someone straps a Crisium Grid or any upgrade to one of those central servers, you're actually going to gain $1 for accessing the upgrade, which is quite nice. I'm like really excited to see whenever anybody like Zahya's into wands a city grid and gets paid like 5 credits for the trouble. You gotta at least trash this for free. But that's kind of cool. And that's kind of it for Zahya. Like, I don't have too much else to say because their ability doesn't force you to build in a certain way besides just having a bit of multi-axis, which is something you're going to have in your deck anyways, because you kind of need multi-axis, the ability to see multiple cards on HQ and R&D to win the game. And right now, if I'm building a good, just regular criminal list, my 2 options or my 3 options now was, would I play 419? Would I play Steve Cambridge? Maybe there's some arguments to play Az, or would I play Zahya? And I think none of these identities really force you to build into their ability too heavily, that it might be pretty easy just to take any 419 deck, cut 5 cards and put Zahya on it. Maybe put a bit more multi-axis, maybe put 3 jailbreaks in it. But they all feel kind of similar for better or for worse. So it's kind of up to you. I feel like Steve and 419 have incredibly strong abilities, and maybe in standard Zahya's ability just to get a bit more credits isn't as compelling as potentially Steve's ability replaying bravados 4 or 5 times throughout a game. But it's definitely something. One thing I do want to shout out for Zahya, and we normally don't say this in these videos, but there's just a really fun interaction Eternal. And this card has rotated out of standard card pool, so you can only do this if you play one of the like bigger wild formats that have like every legal card in Netrunner. But the idea is that you can pop a Hades shard mid-run on HQ and R&D, and then access like 12 cards and archives in the mid-game, and then Zahya can make like 12 to 13 credits, which is pretty wild. Now, again, we've said this for every identity and system gateway, is that the 40 deck minimum is actually like a really big thing, and people might value that. The idea is that like if you play, say this is an Apocalypse Zahya deck, and you want to make sure you Apocalypse sooner than later, having a smaller deck size definitely does help. Now, admittedly, all these other identities are really good at Apocalypsing Steve or 419 for their own reasons, but having a minimum deck size is definitely a good thing to do. That's Zahya. She's good. And I think her in system gateway is fantastic because it encourages you to do the thing that the game should be encouraging you to do anyways. Every turn, try and get an access in, get some money back for doing it, put some pressure in the early game, force the corp to res. And I love that design. I was a big fan of Gabe. Admittedly, Gabe has never very consistently been a competitive Netrunner identity since like the core set. But Zahya does have more flexibility built in, and the minimum deck size does seem quite nice. So I'm a big fan. I like it a lot. Now, our next card is Mutual Favor. This is an event. It costs 0, and it says search your stack for one icebreaker program and reveal it. Shuffle your stack after searching it. If you made a successful run this turn, you may install it. If you do not, just add it to your grip. The real reward is the friends you make along the way. Aw. And it's 3 influence, which is kind of interesting. So we can very definitively say that Mutual Favor is quite a good card. It is quite a good card because this is a direct reprint of an already existing Netrunner card that used to be in standard that was a good card. And this is Special Order. Special Order cost 1 credit, and it had the very same text as Mutual Favor without the clause of letting you install the icebreaker if you made a successful run without spending a click. It's worth noting that when it says you may install it, it doesn't say this specifically, but anytime a card says you may install it, you do have to pay the cost. It's not a free install. So if you're installing your Echelon, you'll pay 3 credits. But this was Special Order, which was very playable and has been playable since it was printed in the original core set to date. And this is just strictly a better version of Special Order. Interestingly enough, this sort of design actually goes really far back. This is from original Netrunner. This is Temple Micro Outlet, and this is the original Special Order. The only difference is it wasn't an icebreaker. It was any sort of program. So this became this, which now becomes this. And honestly, Emergency Tech Micro Outlet still might be the better card because it says program, but icebreaker is good enough, and installing it clicklessly is really, really good. So for 0 credits, you get to look through your deck and find the icebreaker you need for the exact situation you find yourself in. And that is really strong. Well, a lot of times in card games, and I believe this comes from Magic, this ability is called tutoring. And when you tutor, you search through your deck and find the answer you need at the moment you need it. And that's really, really a big deal, let alone in System Gateway, where just the amount of card draw you have is very limited. These are all the card draw cards in System Gateway. We're going to ignore Wildcat Strike. And it's very small, and specifically none of it is criminal. So unless you're splashing influence on things like VR-cation and the card draw on Jailbreak is pretty minimal, this is like a very strong card draw card. It forces you not to have to draw 4 or 5 cards to be able to find your killer when you need it. You just play multiple copies of Mutual Favor and say, oh, I need my killer now. I'll go get it. And that's really strong. Classically, Special Order was actually played in a very, very... there was this play pattern that happened a lot. A lot of times as a criminal, first click, you'd run HQ. Maybe you play a run event to force a res on HQ, but you run HQ and hopefully you'd quickly find out what ice is on HQ. The corp res is something like an enigma. And then you say, okay. And then next turn or later in the same turn, you would have special ordered out your decoder. You would have installed it and you would account siphon them. Again, the game is different now because we don't have account siphon, but this is the idea that early game, if you want to get pressure, they have a single ice on a central server or even on a remote server. You can run, force them to res. You would special order, install your breaker, and then get into HQ. And modernly in System Gateway, there's no strong pressure card like Account Siphon that really just incentivizes you to get in whenever you can at basically any cost. But we have something like Jailbreak. So in the early game where the corp hasn't scored an agenda out because it's turn 2, you can technically get a breaker down and Jailbreak in and see most of their HQ. Well, most is factually incorrect, usually 40% of their HQ. And that's a really big deal. This gives you that pressure early. And again, in System Gateway, the pressure early cards are a bit different than they used to be, but it lets you find the solution when you need it. This is called Classic Man, and it is a deck list from 2018. This is one of Whiteblade's decks. They won the Winnipeg Regional out. And this actually shows you how criminal decks used to be built. And the existence of Special Order really changes how you can build decks. And 2 of the factions right now in Netrunner can build like this. Anarch really can't get away with it too easily. But you'll notice that there's only 1 of each breaker. So this deck has only a single Fractor, and it's Paperclip. And you can get away with this, spending 3 influence on a single Fractor in a 45 card deck, because you don't have to ensure that you draw it. Because you can draw your Paperclip, but also as soon as you draw 1 of your 3 special orders, or modernly 1 of your 3 special mutual favors, you can ensure you have it. And this is a really big deal because now criminals can run high influence breakers and ensure they're going to get them every game and run less copies of each breaker. because again, you don't need to ensure you draw it. As long as you draw a special order, it's like you have multiple copies of the breaker in your deck, if you know what I mean. And this sort of like the construction of criminal decks has been around for such a long time, and mutual favor allows that to continue to happen. The idea is that you can run one of every breaker and then just find it really quickly. You don't need to draw through all your deck, and you can spend more influence on better stuff, and that's really cool. Now, it is worth noting that this sort of, there's weaknesses to this sort of deck building, and maybe Paperclip isn't the best example, but if you run a single nanotech as your killer in your deck, sometimes criminals can struggle when it comes to things like program destruction. Maybe you run into Keegan Lane and destroys your killer, and that can be an issue. Or if you have your single killer in hand and maybe you run central servers and you hit a snare, like that can be a problem. Right now in System Gateway, I think the real threat is Retribution, but you just have to kind of play with that in mind when you build a criminal deck. And one of the best things is criminals have alternate ways to deal with things. So the idea is that if you do end up losing maybe your killer in System Gateway, you still have some alternate ways to deal with ice. Maybe in a panic, you can always still mayfly through some stuff. Maybe you have access to Botulus. Modernly, this is very palatable in a standard format because you have cards like Boomerang, you have cards like Amakua. They see a lot of play in criminal decks because they're flexible answers. And this really helps you. The idea is that you can have a lot of these flexible answers and then one permanent good answer that you can always get with your special order. Or a lot of times you see things like Ngolo. That's a very flexible early pressure card. And that's a lot of times how criminal decks are built in standard. And you can kind of do that in System Gateway. Again, in Gateway, tags have a different strength and tags generally trash your program. So having multiple programs, there's no real recursion. If you lose your breaker in System Gateway, you lose your breaker on the runner side. So there's still a reason to have two of a breaker in System Gateway. But again, that sort of deck building is like allowed with mutual favor, and it's so strong. And the ability to be like, oh, run first click into the remote server. I know what I need. Mutual favor, go. And that's largely talking about mutual favor as if it was just a special order. But we've talked about how not only is it better than special order because it's cheaper, but it also lets you clicklessly install the program as long as you made a successful run. And this is what I love about the criminal cards in System Gateway, is so many of them work so well together. Zahya's ability really recommends or really encourages you to run once per turn. And if you're running consistently and running off often, mutual favor is easy to play to get your program clicklessly to continue that pressure in the next turn. And on top of that, there's so many cards in System Gateway that work well with that. You have things like Red Team that even incentivize you sometimes to run an uniced archives to gain 3 credits, and then your mutual favor comes in. You have Pennyshaver, which makes every run profitable. Mind you, we'll be talking more about these cards later, but then you have things like Leech as well. Again, these things you want to play in your Zahya deck. Anything that gives you benefit for running, and then anything that allows you to run and continue to run, like mutual favor, is going to be so important. In standard, everything that we said here really still works, and I think DreamNet also is a really nice one. Basically, there's a lot of cards in the card pool that are run-based cards that trigger unsuccessful runs, and Mutual Favor does that as well. So it allows you to build a deck differently and spend more influence on singleton good breakers, because not all the breakers in Criminal are really good. And if you have good breakers, getting into centrals is cheaper. And then if it's cheaper, you can spend more of your econ cards, and then you can get in more often, and you spend less money getting in. That gives you more money. You see, the Criminal cycle continues. The wheel keeps spinning of make a run, get paid. And all this stuff really helps. Anything that can quickly get you to make a run, have a breaker, get paid is fantastic. Mutual Favor will be good. And this is going to be a 2 of in a lot of decks for a long time coming. One thing actually that is worth knowing, and this is interesting, I've noticed this over the past year or so, is that while classically Special Order was sometimes a 3 of in a lot of Criminal decks that wanted to really quickly get the breakers so they could hit account siphons or stuff like that, I guess a bit modernly, there's some decks that actually do run fewer of these. So this is a Tug to Guts deck from back in June of last year, but you notice this deck actually doesn't run anything like that. It doesn't run any special orders because it has access to things like Boomerang. It has a bit more better card draw because now Class Act was a thing. So the card draw, the consistency, the card draw is a bit better in Criminal. You also have cards like Deuce's Wild, which is a card draw, and you have access to Amakua, which is, again, a very strong universal breaker. So a lot of these decks don't actually need to find a specific breaker at the right time, as long as they have access to a flexible utility card. So I felt like I was just saying that this card is really good, but I do want to highlight that there are certain decks that might not need it, or at least might not need 3 of them like we used to play. You can get away with 1 or 2 just to find the answers when you really need them, but there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of pressure if you have things like Boomerang, Inside Job, Amakua. That's Mutual Favor. It's great. It's like very clearly great. It's Special Order plus, and Special Order was very competitively playable. All right, we have another Criminal event. This is Tread Lightly. For 1 credit, you have a run event, a really fun type of event, and it just says run any server. During that run, the res cost of each piece of ice is increased by 3 credits. And there's a flavor text. It says a microfiber mod or high-end mantle can be helpful, but nothing beats a good dose of keeping your damn head down. Gopher Orion. 1 single influence. Man, so firstly, this art is fantastic. If you don't know that sort of that figure in the background, there's actually 2 of them, is a surveyor, which used to be a very prevalent Netrunner ice in competitive card pool. It's specifically a really good ice because the more ice you put on a server, the stronger these things get, and they can get really hard to deal with in the mid to late game. And I love that they're just ducking underneath the surveyors. It also kind of gives you a message about when's the best time to play Tread Lightly, which is on a remote server, hopefully with a lot of ice, because that 3 credits will be on each piece of ice. We'll get to that in a second. So Tread Lightly is really, really strong in system gateway from my experience. This card has been like absolutely doing work on me because it's so hard to play around. So the idea is in system gateway, it's the early game. You're playing Corp. You don't have a lot of money because there isn't that much economy options in system gateway. And so you're trying to jam an agenda behind an early. Maybe you got a Palisade. And then maybe on top of it, you have a Managarm Skunkworks, and that's your remote server. And you're feeling pretty good about it because it's like turn 2 and you have 5 credits plus whatever you need to score the agenda. And then whoever you're playing against, maybe it's Zahya. Again, it could be anybody. This is a 1 influence card. Tread Lightly is the remote. And now you're in a really awkward situation. Maybe they put a Mayfly down too, because you know that they can get into the remote, but also you're in a horrible situation because paying 6 credits for the Palisade is awful. That's most of your money. And then you're paying 6 credits and probably still losing the agenda a lot of time. Or then if you res this, then you can't res the Managarm. So you're trying to figure out which one is better. The idea is that in the early game, rushing out early agendas is very hard if you don't have a lot of money with Tread Lightly, because Tread Lightly really goofs the math that you've probably perfectly done. If you're trying to score out behind a Brawn in the early game, you got to pay 9 for this. That's incredible. 9 is so much. If the Corp installs and then advances and built to last Pharos, you know it's a Pharos because it's the only advanceable ice in the whole system gateway. You can now safely Tread Lightly if you know they have less than 10 credits. And imagine paying 10 credits for this in system gateway. It's unimaginable. It's so much money. And Tread Lightly can make that sort of ice that you thought, oh, this is my good early ice that I'm going to rush behind because it's very affordable, into something that costs almost the most expensive ice in all of system gateway. And it's such a blowout if you don't play around this. I find myself in a lot of situations, like I've said, where I have a Palisade, Managarm, maybe a Diviner or White Space in front of that. And suddenly it's like, oh, they've installed a Mayfly and they've done this. And I'm in a terrible situation. And Tread Lightly to me feels like the system gateway inside job. We talked about this a bit when we talked about what criminals are. Inside Job is a really strong card that's been in basically every core set to date. And the idea is that you can't score behind a single ice with criminal because there's always a threat that a criminal has an inside job. And what that does is it slows the game down. It makes sure that the corporation is going to put 2 ice on the remote server and also afford to res the 2 ice on the server. And the longer you slow the game down, so the corporation doesn't feel safe scoring behind a single ice, the more often more agendas will build up in HQ. And then that means the more often like multi-axis on HQ will actually trigger successfully and steal agendas. That is actually like a really big part of the game right now. The idea is that if you don't feel comfortable scoring early into a Tread Lightly, the game's going to slow down. And if the game slows down, that means you have more time to put on economic pressure. The multi-axis on HQ gets better. The Corp has to like res ice on central servers to prevent you from getting that pressure, getting that free Zahya dollars, but then also have a lot of money for the remote server. And that's important to say, is that this ice almost always is best, or sorry, this operation, one more time, this run event, got it, is almost always best to play on a remote server. Just because that makes it really awkward. It really does. What's in the remote server is generally more often to be an agenda than that single access off the top of R&D or the 1 in 5 on HQ. A lot of times the things in the remote server is either something you really need to trash because it's like a regolith mining and you don't want to let the corp have that, or it is an agenda. So a lot of times, I think 9 out of 10 times if I'm Tread Lightly, it's because I'm doing it on a remote server. And that is interesting because we talked about how criminals don't have economic pressure the way that they do in standard within System Gateway. They don't have anything that's like run HQ, make the corp lose credits, which if you ask me was like pretty central to the criminal card pool. And the only way that they have economic pressure is in Tread Lightly. And it is really strong economic pressure. Again, if you want to score with like a Brawn into a Monogarm, you're going to need 11 credits just to even consider that. And even if you can res all that stuff, you still need more money to score the agenda out. And this can really slow the game down. And that accentuates your early aggression because it spreads the corp thin where they need to ice essentials and then also go for the remote. And one influence on this is the thing that finds me getting blown out in so many games where I'm playing against Tau. And then suddenly, it's a shaper, but suddenly I need like 9 credits for a remote server when I thought I needed 4. Wait, that actually isn't possible. It would have to be by 6 or 3. You know what I mean? And that's wild. It is such a strong card in System Gateway, and you can put this and probably should put 1 or 2 in any deck you play in Gateway just because it does goof the math up and it makes the corp scared, where they have to understand, I'm going to try and score now, but I don't have enough money to deal with Tread Lightly, but I can't afford to go slower than this. Also, it is worth noting, as a corp, just like a runner, you need to have money to make money. So forcing the runner to spend a lot of money puts them far away from things like government subsidy. And it's also really important to know when playing things like Zahya, that's why I love early pressure, is if you force the corp to spend money, especially if you're playing against Wayland built to last, they're going to be farther away from their econ cards like government subsidy. So pressure on is doubly good. That's Tread Lightly. It's really strong for 1 influence. Do it on the remote server. Pressure the corp. They have to play like you have it, and if they don't, the blowouts can be horrendous. What about in system or in standard format? How does it look? And I think there's a lot of identities that can consider playing Tread Lightly, and a big part of it is that it's only 1 influence, 1 credit. Like, it's so easy to play. Reina Roja already makes ice more expensive to res with Xanadu or not. So these Tread Lightlies get 4 credits more expensive on the first piece of ice. And if they don't res, maybe you could even Tread Lightly on a central server. Then you can get en passant and start destroying the ice that they chose not to res. Ken Tenma is a run-based criminal, and having Tread Lightly be free in Ken Tenma is not bad whatsoever. It gives you a lot of value. You don't pay anything for it. That's quite nice. And again, that's just credit aggression. It is economic pressure. You got prepaid voice pad. Anybody can get a bit of value on this. So it's a 1 credit card. Might as well play it for free. And there's also a lot of other ways in the criminal card pool in which you can force corps to res and de-res ice and have a really fun deck that kind of goofs that up. We have forge activation orders. So you can see a piece of ice and force the corp to res it. Maybe you force a nice res on R&D or on HQ, so they want to res it. And suddenly they don't have enough money to protect their remote server when you run in with a Tread Lightly. On top of that, you can actually combine Tread Lightly really intelligently with a bit of expose. I think this is the only neutral expose card in the whole game, but if you see what a piece of ice is on a remote server, you know exactly how much money the corp has or doesn't have to res it. And so Tread Lightly can sometimes be a very, very directed kind of inside job where you say like, oh, I know that the corp can res this with Tread Lightly, so I'm going to go in now. And maybe if the corp has too much money, Hernando Cortez can be such a wild swing. If the corp is feeling very comfortable, oh, I'm on 18 credits. You put down Hernando Cortez and then you Tread Lightly and they end up spending 14 credits to res a single Anansi. It's pretty wild. And one of the best things again about Tread Lightly, it's 3 credits per piece of ice. And that is a really big deal when there's multiple ice on a server and each of them gets hit by a Tread Lightly, as long as you can get through the ice to force them to res more ice. So Jinja City Grid is a fast remote server glacier building card. So they have 4 or 5 ice, as long as you can get through everything. And that can be a tall order, mind you. They can end up spending an immense premium on that. It's a really good pressure. And lastly, we talked about exposed, and falsified credentials is actually a really good combination with Tread Lightly. Knowing when to use this, when to do the Tread Lightly on the remote server to get the agenda, as opposed to, running Tread Lightly a remote server and the corp says, I'm not going to res anything. And then you access a Nico campaign or something. It's much better that you put the pressure when there's an agenda on the line. And having a bit of exposed to know and make intelligent decisions is very, very important. Leave No Trace, mind you, is a card that sees almost no play in the standard format. And I'm a big fan of this card. And this to me feels a lot like Tread Lightly. And at this point, I feel like you could put all of these in the same deck. The idea is that you force some really awkward reses with Leave No Trace, and then you also have the Tread Lightly threat, and then maybe on top of that you can play some other D-res, but the idea is that you can make expensive ice, and even sometimes mid to cheap ice, a liability for the corp, where they need to re-res them multiple times, let alone pay 3 credits extra with Tread Lightly. Now, an interesting way to play Tread Lightly as an early pressure tool. And again, we talked about running a remote server with multiple ice on it, but sometimes it's good enough with just 1 piece of ice. So these are some of the Asa list decks. Now this list will be a bit differently modernly because Violet level clearance just got banned. But a lot of times what this deck will do is turn one, click one, get like something like Rashida Yahim behind a Gatekeeper or a Hagen. That's a very strong play. In Criminal or even in any faction, it's really easy to play a turn one tread lightly into the remote server. And a lot of times that corp can't afford or doesn't want to afford spending 7 credits to res a Hagen. And so that you get a run into the remote server, trash the Rashida, or even sometimes an early agenda. And that's kind of cool. I think that's least likely to pan out with Inside Criminal, because Criminal does have access to sort of things like Boomerang or Inside Job that do give that sort of ability, but are more guaranteed. But for one influence, I'm actually interested to see what this can do out of faction as like an early aggressive card to charge remote servers or to have economic pressure come out of nowhere. And I'm really interested in that. The idea that like potentially what a Riel kit deck could play and put some pressure on. Oh, you only have 10 influence, maybe not, but you know what I mean, right? Like just about any deck can be playing this, and it's something that a lot of people won't play around. They'll think, oh, I have 7 credits, my ice costs 5, I'm good. And then there's a huge blowout potential with Tread Lightly. Cool. 1 influence, 1 cost card. It's a menace on System Gateway, and I'm excited to see where it sees play outside of that. Moving on, we have a piece of hardware. This is Docklands Pass. It is a unique 2-cost hardware. It says the first time each turn you breach HQ, access 1 additional card. There's a flavor text that says Zahya knows the keeper of every door between the Docklands and the domes. More importantly, she knows their price. Man, this is a fantastic card. And this is like a lot of other cards you see in System Gateway, a direct reprint or like the reimagining, I think that's more accurate, of an existing card. And we showed this card before. This is the HQ interface. And this card came down for twice as much as Docklands Pass and said whenever you access cards from HQ, access 1 additional card. Now, this is obviously very expensive. And one of the difference between Docklands Pass, it says the first time a turn you make a run on HQ, and HQ interface said every single time. But HQ interface was also not unique. So there were some decks that would install 2 or 3 of these for 8 or 12 credits and then run HQ and always see 3 cards or 4 cards. And that's very, very powerful. But this card saw very, very little to no play in criminal decks for the last couple of years on the basis that it's just really, really, really expensive. And I like how Docklands Pass is a much more affordable version, albeit comes with some drawbacks compared to the 4 credit HQ interface, but you're okay with those drawbacks when it costs this little. So firstly, in Gateway, this is such a valuable card. You'll play it in Zahya. You want to play in Zahya, of course, not only because she's on the art, but now every time that you run HQ, or at least once per turn, the first time you run HQ, you'll make 2 credits with Zahya. We've just built our own Gabriel Santiago, feels great, and you're going to access 2 additional cards. And so really important to know that in System Gateway, multi-access is at a premium. There's only 3 cards, again, that will let you run centrals and see multiple cards. You got Docklands Pass, which you definitely want to run, and then you also have Jailbreak. And one of the nice things about Docklands Pass is that it's a hardware with an ongoing ability. You don't have to make a click to make a run event. Like you don't have to do a click to make a run with the Docklands Pass. So you can also combine this with things like Jailbreak. So run HQ, see 3 cards. That's really, really strong. And this card represents the multi-access that you have in System Gateway. Or not, sorry, I didn't mean to say the multi-access. The HQ pressure you have in System Gateway. And it's very different than the criminals in the core set that, you know, I learned Netrunner with, the original core sets, right? The idea is a lot of times in System Gateway, you'll have an agenda in your hand that you don't want to score at this point in time because you've spent a bit of time keeping that criminal Zahya out. So she's not getting free credits. You've kind of been a bit scared on the remote. Maybe you're clicking for a couple more credits because you're worried about Tread Lightly, and the agendas pile up in HQ. So Docklands Pass is one of the nicest ways to scoop those agendas out of HQ. Seeing 2 cards is so good. As opposed to making 2 runs on HQ, seeing 2 singles, it's a lot better because you're guaranteed not to see the same card. That's amazing. And this is the only HQ pressure card, I believe, in all of System Gateway besides Jailbreak. And that's very different than, you know, some of the old system or old core sets. So it's definitely something different. Now, one thing that's interesting about Docklands Pass, and I do want to say that I believe I've put this as a one of in every single System Gateway deck I've built so far, just to ensure that you do have some sort of HQ pressure outside of Jailbreak. I think it's really valuable. And for 2 influence, it's a super easy slot to put into your deck. Is that criminals, or sorry, as corporations, you do have a lot of tools in System Gateway to play around that sort of HQ pressure. The idea is that if you have an orbital superiority in your hand and you don't have any plans to score it anytime soon, it's very easy to build a deck that has like three spin doctors in it and like 1 to 3 sprints in it. So you can always carve your hand and ensure there's not agendas hanging out in it. And that's kind of wild when in a format where this is the only strong HQ pressure, it is also the format where it's the easiest for the corp to ensure that there's no agendas in hand. So it doesn't always line up well. I think this feels better in the starting neutral decks where you don't have access to spin doctor or sprint. But once you start deck building, as a corp, I definitely recommend you to play either sprint or spin doctor, if not both. But I still think with all that, as a runner, especially in Zahya, you do still want to play Docklands Pass just to have some pressure on HQ. So the corp can't always just comfortably hold one agenda in there and hope that you don't hit it on the 1 and 5. That's Docklands Pass. And again, I think it's as simple as that. In System Gateway, you want to play it because it lets you see multiple cards in HQ, and that's a powerful ability. And 2 credits to influence is a pretty easy cost. And if we want to talk about standard format, the pretty easy cost is actually a really big deal. There's a lot of decks and a lot of criminal decks that will play a copy of Legwork, maybe 2 Legworks. And we'll talk about other out-of-faction decks that will spend 2 influence on a single Legwork. And Docklands Pass can probably be that first Legwork in every single deck. The idea is that it costs the same. Sure, you have to spend a click installing it before you're making any runs. But if you get this down early, now every single HQ run you make is way more valuable. And one of the cool things about having multi-axis that's attached to hardware is that you can do other run effects. You can run HQ now with a Bravado and still have a mini legwork worth of value of accesses. Or maybe you can do some hot pursuits, get a lot of money, take a tag, but still see 2 cards. It's also a really natural interaction with Rip Deal, which lets you recur 2 cards after accessing HQ or not accessing an HQ. I think it's a really big deal why you want to consider this, and especially where it's like the ability of HQ interface was always good, but it was always just a bit too expensive. And cutting that cost in half and attaching it to the same cost of a card that criminals already played means this will see play in criminal decks. I don't think I'll build a criminal deck for a long time that doesn't have at least one of these in the list. Now, maybe I'm going a bit out of order here, but it is worth noting when to and when not criminal HQ pressure matters in System Gateway. And maybe we should have talked this a bit more when we talked about Sprinter Spin Doctor. But I've seen a lot of games in System Gateway where runners will run HQ because they have their Docklands Pass and they think they're going to hit an agenda. But there's a lot of times where running HQ is probably not the right play. I think one of the best situations to really nail this is if a corp has a strong remote server with an Anoetic Void in it, and you see them on the turn like drawing a bit, and they have this like ice remote. The idea is like always look at the board state and try and think, if the corporation had an agenda, would they keep it in HQ or would they put it in the remote server? And I think Docklands Pass is always going to be strong, but if the corp is set up in a certain way, sometimes the HQ pressure isn't that valuable, where every agenda the corp has, they're jamming into the remote server. At that point, you might need to reevaluate your plans a bit. Now, we talked about, again, slowing down the corp, forcing them to spend money the ways that they don't want to, forcing them to fear your things like Tread Lightly or Inside Job and Boomerang in standard format, really values, it makes the HQ pressure a lot better because then they're not scoring out. So then multiple agendas will gather up in HQ, and then the chance of your Docklands Pass sliming in and getting multiple agendas gets way higher. And with a really heavy heart to some extent, this sort of forcing the corp to draw, this sort of mill-esque idea, Fisk Investment Seminar, this just rotated. And this is one of the best things that you could classically play when it came to HQ pressure. You'd say, oh, looks like the corp is trying to score an agenda next turn. Let's Fisk them and force them to draw 3 cards and then mandatory draw. And now they have an agenda in the remote that they plan to score, but they also now have suddenly like 9 cards in hand. And that means when they discard down, they'll probably have multiple agendas in their hand and maybe still an agenda in the remote. And this worked really well. This paired really, really incredibly well with HQ pressure. But we don't have a card like this. And I really wanted to see if Nisei cares about this sort of mill archetype because it was a really weird niche thing that criminals could do. I think one last thing I want to touch on with Docklands Pass is this says the first time each turn you breach HQ. And HQ interface actually didn't care about running. It said whenever you access cards from HQ, access 1 additional card. And Gang Sign was a banned card. It has been banned for a long time. It just rotated. HQ interface interacted very favorably with Gang Signs, let alone multiple Gang Signs. You could get down 2 Gang Signs and then 2 HQ interfaces, and you didn't even have to do anything. And anytime that the corp scored an agenda, you'd access 2 cards, access another 2 cards from HQ. And while Gangside has rotated, the wording of Docklands Pass means that it'll only trigger on runs. So whether we can see more cards like this that can get incidental accesses from HQ, they might not be as overbearing with the new changes to Docklands Pass versus HQ interface. That's Docklands Pass. In System Gateway, it's great. You'll play it. In Zahya, it's great. It's an econ card. You see more cards, get more credits with her ability, and HQ Pressure is very relevant. This is, in fact, the biggest HQ Pressure card in all of System Gateway. And outside of it, you'll probably play it over a legwork. Maybe if you play multiple legworks, you'll change one of them for Docklands Pass. Playing 2 of these in a deck kind of feels bad because it is unique, but I think you play one and maybe play a legwork and feels good. I'll be playing this in almost every criminal deck going forward. Cool. Our next card is Pennyshaver. And maybe this is a cop-out. Let me know how y'all feel about this. But maybe a month ago at this point, maybe 2 months ago at this point, the nice people in Nice actually gave us 3 cards to spoil in Spoilers Week. And we have a video up about it. And we talked about 3 specific cards that we're going to be talking about now. Pennyshaver. We talked about Tranquilizer and Red Team. And I would actually highly recommend you. I don't know how this works on YouTube. I think there's going to be a box up there or something. I don't know how the functionality works at the moment, but I'd actually recommend you to go back and maybe watch those videos if you want, because I spend more time talking about these cards. It was really exciting too. It was the first time we saw them. And since playing them, I don't think my opinion on any of these cards have changed in any meaningful way. I think we were, at least, I still stand by what we said there. So if you want a bit of a deeper conversation about those cards, I'd recommend you to check that out. I'll still talk about them, but I'm going to keep it a bit more surface level, just on the basis that I feel like we went over a lot of this before. If this feels bad, let me know, and then we'll maybe not half-ass this in the future. This is Pennyshaver. It's Zahya's console. It costs 3 credits. It's unique. It gives you 1 MU, so you can install more programs. And it says, whenever you make a successful run, place a credit on this hardware. Then as a click, you can place 1 credit on this hardware, then take all the credits from it. And like almost all consoles, limit 1 console per player. And there's some flavor text that says, braggarts chase big heights, patience enriches skimming fractions of a credit at a time. Quoted from Zahya. It's 3 influence. So pennyshaving is a legitimate modern criminal practice. It's pejoratively also known as salami slicing. And the idea is that pennyshaving is the fraudulent practice of stealing money repeatedly in extremely small quantities, usually by taking advantage of rounding to the nearest cent. So if you've watched Office Space, or I think it's Superman 2 or Superman 3, the idea is that off of every transaction, if you shave around a penny down and you keep that penny, that often isn't flagged by security protocols or what have you. And that's not very profitable, but the idea is that if you're doing thousands, if not millions of transactions, those pennies that you've stolen really add up. And that's the idea of salami slicing or penny shaving. It also does show up in security. The idea is like small security attacks might not be noticed or investigated by some security systems, but a bunch of small attacks can really add up together into a large attack. That's the idea of what a penny shaving is. And if you read the lore article that came, Deliverance, I believe it's called, that came up alongside Zahya's spoil, you actually see her using it. It's a console that's up her sleeve, and she uses this to do little rounding, shaving money off of all the transactions she does as some sort of broker. I think she what does she exactly do? Like imports and exports. She gets people things that they want. That's a Pennyshaver. And it's a console that gets you credits on successful runs. And again, as we saw, I think this is the second card we talked about in the recap of criminal stuff. Making credits on successful runs is their thing. This is Desperado, which hasn't been in the standard format for a while, and it's probably one of the strongest consoles ever printed. And this gave you a credit on every single run that you made successfully. It just gave it to you. And Pennyshaver is a bit different. Every time you make a successful run, you put a credit on the Pennyshaver, and then as a click, you can put another credit on the Pennyshaver. It's not coming from your credit pool. It's coming from the bank. And then you take all the money off. And it's definitely a bit slower than Desperado because you actually have to click the money off of it, but it gives you a lot of money. And it's very generous that the action of taking the money off of it is always going to be better than clicking for credit, if not equal, because you always at least put a credit on it before you take it off. It's also worth comparing to another card that is in the standard format that classically we said was the reprint of Desperado, which is Paragon, which is a very similar card, but it gives you a credit on the first successful run of a turn as opposed to every successful run with Pennyshaver. But then it also lets you kind of scry your deck. Look at the top card, choose to put it on the bottom. And since Pennyshaver has come out, I haven't seen anybody play Paragon. It looks like Paragon has been largely just replaced by Pennyshaver, valuing all that money you can make off multiple successful runs as opposed to once a turn. It seems to be a bit better in the standard card pool, or the standard meta, excuse me, than Paragon. Paragon's scry ability doesn't seem as necessary with other card draw cards we have in the modern format. Pennyshaver is really good. It's wild. Like, you put this down, click one, maybe in a Zahya deck, and then that's the whole idea. You start running. You run HQ, you force them to res ice, you run R&D. And now with Pennyshaver, every run you're making with Zahya, it's 2 credits worth of value. 1 on your Pennyshaver, 1 on Zahya if you're accessing a single card off of R&D. And then you can add that with everything else we've talked about before, or we're going to continue to talk about today. Like, Leech is so good. It's really good. It lets you be aggressive and make money at the same time. Again, this is so good criminal stuff. Make runs, get paid. And again, in a game of Netrunner, you're going to need to make a lot of runs. Why not get paid at the same time? So again, run a lot. It also makes like any run technically profitable. So the idea is, if you want to run archives just to be able to next click mutual favor down a breaker, it's not that bad, right? Like, you're getting that free install, but you're also running archives to gain a credit on the Pennyshaver. Again, Leech counter is fantastic. Maybe you're just trying to flip Jinteki restoring humanity just so they're not getting credit a turn. It makes any run good. And I'm not saying that you should just be running archives for no reason to get Pennyshaver credits, but the idea is that there's so many other things in the card pool that make those runs a lot better. Now, I know last time we talked about this in the video that maybe you've watched at this point, hopefully, is that we talked about clicking this. In theory, you want to click this as little as possible. And I've played games where very consistently I'm clicking this after like 5-6 turns after I've installed it, and I take 10 to 11 credits off of it. And that feels immense, and it feels really, really good. The idea is that like I can put this down and continue to run off all that criminal economy. And maybe when I'm feeling a bit out of gas, then I can hit the Pennyshaver and recover, and then I'm back at that pressure. But the big thing about Pennyshaver is, if you ever find yourself clicking for credits, it's generally better to take money off the Pennyshaver. Even if you made a single run on archives, a single run on R&D, this has 1 credit on it. If you're going to click for a credit at the end of your turn, you might as well click for 2 by adding 1 to the Pennyshaver and then taking the 2 off. So it's not a good reason why you should be clicking for credits. It's something you kind of want to avoid in Netrunner, because you can do a lot of things that are a bit more better for your time, a bit more efficient than just clicking for a credit. But this means if you're ever clicking for a credit, at least you can do this. Hopefully you're clicking for 3 or 4 if you made a couple runs in the last couple turns. It's really, really good. It's also really strong because it's whenever you make a successful run, and that's a really big deal if you're dealing with asset lists. The idea is that Near Earth Hub, or I should actually show this one, right, is making a lot of remote servers. You can check them even if you're not trashing them and getting value. And in System Gateway, you're definitely going to play it. You definitely want to draw it early. I'm generally putting 2 in my System Gateway decks if I'm playing Zahya, just to ensure every game I do see it. Maybe you can put 3 if you're really aggressive, but it feels bad putting 3 of a unique card where the other copies don't do anything. But you're going to play it in Zahya, and it's going to be a really big deal, and it's very likely to make you a lot of money doing the thing you always wanted to do anyways. And outside of Gateway, it's going to see play. Any criminal wants to play this. All the criminals, again, are making a lot of runs because the way that their cards work, make credits or make run, get paid again. And there's also reason to play this out of faction. I think we recently played on the channel the Valencia Estevez of Wildcat Decklist of the Week. It's a Val deck that has bad publicity, so the runs are a bit cheaper already, and then we're getting credits at the same time, so we can kind of convert our bad publicity into real credits. And maybe you can just pull a mining accident in any criminal or anarch or what have you, and then you get really cheap runs. And the cool thing about that as well, Pennyshaver, is you could play it in any aggressive deck. It gives you a lot of money attached to the idea that you're running consistently. And if you can make an aggressive Shaper deck, for instance, maybe a Kiko Nisei, maybe even Tau from System Gateway, you can make a lot of money at the same time. And I think DreamNet is also one of my favorites. The idea is you can build this 2-card engine that says first successful run a turn, make a credit, draw a card. That's so good. That's so much value for, again, doing the thing you wanted to do anyways. Again, we went a bit more depth into the original video, but everything we said there still stays true. It's a really strong console. It's giving you a lot of money. And it's interesting that Paragon is now saying almost no play, because again, the card draw has gotten a bit more consistent anyways with things like Class Act. Like you're drawing well anyways. You don't need the scry ability. Specifically, also if you're playing Zahya, you have a 40 card deck, so you don't need that sort of value draw anyways, and your deck is a bit more consistent. And Pennyshaver is just good. I have clicked this for 11 credits in so many games. Let's move on to a killer. This is Carmen, the criminal's killer in System Gateway. It costs 5 credits to install. It takes up 1 MU, and it's a program. It's Icebreaker, killer subtype. And it says, if you made a successful run this turn, this program costs 2 less credits to install. It can break 1 sentry subroutine for 1 credit if you've matched strength. Interface is a reminder there. And 2 credits to give yourself 3 strength. And there's a little quote there. It says, the whole wide world your domain, for law your own free will. It comes in at 2 strength and 2 influence. So that name and the text at the bottom, Carmen, is a reference to the French opera Carmen by Georges Bizet. It was written in the late 19th century. You might actually be pretty familiar with this opera, even if you don't know it. There's 2 big songs that are kind of part of the pop classical canon. It's the Habanera and the Toreador song. Look them up. You'll probably be more familiar with them than you think. And this text alone, the whole wide world your domain, actually comes from a section at the end of the Act 2. Here we go. And this is sung, I think originally Carmen sings this a bit earlier, and then it comes back into the chorus. It's a story about a soldier who falls in love with a gypsy factory worker. I believe it's a cigarette factory. And then there's a story about their love affair, and then all the jealousy and everything that shows up. And so this is it's a cool reference. Carmen also specifically, she worked with or kind of was with smugglers, which is a really cool theme when Zahya specifically is a smuggler. So that is the lore there. And if you look up some of the representation of Carmen herself, the clothing she wore and some of the stage productions, it's actually pretty similar to this with the flowing dress. All right, so it's a killer. And is one of the 2 killers within System Gateway. This one comes in for 5 credits. Mind you, if you made a successful run, 3 credits. 1 for 1 sentry subroutine, not bad. 2 for 3 strength, that's a bit iffy. But what are we comparing this with in System Gateway? How do we know that this is good? Well, your other option is Echelon. And Echelon is incredibly similar to it. It comes in at 3 credits, which is what you're hoping to pay for Carmen anyways. 1 for 1 subroutine, and then 3 for 2 strength, which is similar. It's a bit backwards, but it's kind of the same idea. But this program gets +1 strength for each installed icebreaker, including this one. So it actually technically comes in at 1 strength. And the big question when you're looking at killers or icebreakers in general in any meta, let alone System Gateway, is you're trying to figure out which one of these is better, let alone better maybe for the influence. And these are actually incredibly comparable. There are 4 sentries within System Gateway. And I'm going to ignore Tithe by putting my face over it because both of the killers break this for the same 2 credits. But most of the killers are, or in fact, all the sentries, are 3 or 4 strength. And 4 strength is actually the really nice breakpoint when it comes to Carmen. You have to boost once. You pay 2, and then you pay 1 for subroutine. So the worst you're ever paying for a sentry in System Gateway is, I believe, 5 credits if you break in on cell. Now, Echelon can be a bit worse, but the idea with Echelon in the late game, you'll have a lot of, in theory, a lot of programs installed or specific icebreakers installed. So by the late game, Echelon will actually be 4 strength. So instead of paying 4 for Carmen to break an on cell, or sorry, 5 to break an on cell, you'll probably be breaking this for 3 credits. Now, I think that's a really good representation of the differences between shapers and criminals. Criminals are all about early aggression. They want to get down, they want to go, and they want to make their runs successful to get paid. But shapers can sit back maybe a bit more and want to install a lot more things. So Echelon represents a late game solution, while Carmen is the best early game solution, because Echelon can be prohibitively expensive within the early game and System Gateway. Now, I think one of the best things you can play with Carmen is Leech. I think Leech is so good because, again, Leech gives you a virus counter that lets you lower the strength of an ice you're encountering. And Leech is also something that you just get free value if you're running HQ and R&D consistently in a Zahya deck because you want to get your Pennyshaver, you want to get your Zahya ability, you want to get your Docklands Pass. And these counters are very valuable. The idea is that if you run into a Karuna with a Leech counter, you can make a 2 strength, and then you're actually saving 2 credits. So if you imagine each Leech counter being worth 2 to 3 credits, maybe sometimes, that's a lot of value attached to that. And I wouldn't play Carmen without playing Leech in a deck. I think they work really, really well together. Whenever you see awkward, big strength boosts, Leeches can add up and help you a lot. Now that's largely when it comes to what you want to do in System Gateway. I feel like Carmen is definitely really good in Criminal, and I don't know if I would go out of the way to spend influence on an Echelon, just because Criminals, you want that early aggression. There's maybe a chance you can play a single Echelon for the late game, but Carmen is really, really good. Now, I would probably end up splashing Carmen over Echelon if I'm building out a faction System Gateway. Maybe I'm building a Lu deck, and mind you, Anarchs don't have access to a killer, so they generally want to. But I just feel like I want to be a bit more aggressive. Generally, that's how I play, and I'm not going to wait for installing all my echelons or all my other icebreakers. I kind of just like to go. We haven't talked about this a lot, but if you install this thing for 5 credits, it's kind of expensive. I think that makes it the most expensive program in System Gateway, if I'm not mistaken. But the idea is that if you make a successful run, you save 2 credits on this is so good. Now, I've seen so many plays where I'm playing System Gateway and a runner just runs archives when there's like no cards in it face down, and I'm confused. And then they install a Carmen. And even if you do that, that's not bad. It's like clicking for 2 credits, run archives and install this. Yeah, that first run on archives is just basically like gaining 2 credits. And again, we talked about all the run event stuff, or all the, successful run triggers, getting a leech token, Pennyshaver, etc. can make that really, really, really good. So I think Carmen is quite good. And I generally, you get this down for 3 credits. It's hard to think of a situation in which you don't. There'd have to be a central or a sentry on every central server that you're scared of, and or maybe you need to get this down a run and you have too few clicks to get the value before charging a remote server. I think it's solid. Outside of Gateway though, is it going to see play? And this is actually kind of interesting. In Criminal, the one killer that you sees the most play right now is Bagalter. And Bagalter also comes down for 3 credits, so Carmen usually does as well. But Bagalter has simpler numbers, 1 for 1 sentry subroutine, 1 for 1 strength. But the difference with Bagalter, and it does come in at lower strength, is that if you break all subroutines on a piece of ice, you get 2 credits of a refund. That could be a big deal. Now, if we look at something like Anansi, which is a pretty common sentry we see in Jinteki decks, Bagalter actually has to pay a lot to get through this. You have to pay 4 to boost, 3 to break, so you pay 7. If it's your first sentry you broke a turn, you get 2 back. So you're ending paying 5 for your first Anansi. But if you look at Carmen, Carmen's specifically very well situated to break things that are 5 strength. Because you actually end up breaking Anansi for the same credits. You actually break every single Anansi you encounter for 5 strength. And that's kind of interesting. The idea is that Carmen's actually really good against bigger strength things. Anything that's 5 strength, or specifically exactly 5 strength, this lines up really well. Now, I do think in in standard, I'm probably going to continue just to play Bagalter, is because Bagalter doesn't sweat the small stuff. Drafter is like a very common ice you see in HB decks, and you need to be able to deal this pretty quickly in the competitive meta. And if you get your Carmen down, you're breaking this for like 4 credits, which is a lot. And admittedly, Bagalter does eventually break this for 4 credits, but the first time you break this a turn, it's only 2 credits, and you can install this from hand and not have to worry about the successful run. Like, that's definitely nice, but they're kind of comparable. But Bagalter just seems a lot easier to use. That is for sure. But I feel like in System Gateway, you don't feel bad about this. It is also worth noting, we didn't talk about this when we talked about the identities of what criminals are. Criminals are meant to have the best killers in the game. That is mostly true. I think Bagalter still kind of outshines it, but Carmen is definitely quite solid within Gateway. Talk about breakers within System Gateway. This is Marjanah, I think. It costs 0 to install. That's nice. It's an icebreaker and a fractor. It's a program as well. And interface. So if you match strength on a barrier, you can spend 2 credits to break a single barrier subroutine. But very similarly in some ways to Carmen, if you made a successful run this turn, this ability costs 1 credit less to use. So if you made a successful run this turn, you're breaking subroutines for 1 credit per subroutine instead of 2. And it's also 1 for 1 strength. So 1 credit plus 1 strength. And as a flavor text, it says you can't rule a kingdom by standing still. Zahya Sadeghi. It comes in a 1 strength, which is pretty low, but it's also 1 influence, which means this is very easy to splash. Now, Marjanah is a reference. If you look it up, you might get this article about a crater on Saturn. But Marjanah specifically, even the crater is named after a queen visited by Bahram and his crew in the tale of Kamar al-Zaman, which is the book of it shows up, in the book of 1001 Nights. This is often referred to as 1001 Arabian Nights, or just Arabian Nights in English, and it's a collection of Middle Eastern folklore tales. There's a lot of stories within this, and Marjanah shows up specifically in a story, the tale of Kamar al-Zaman. Unfortunately, I don't know too much about the story just because this website hurts to look at. But she's a queen of a city that they run into, and I wish I knew a bit more whether there's a reference to a lion in that, or breaking barriers or something. But this really hurts to look at. I don't know who could possibly read that. So as a fractor within System Gateway, how good is Marjanah? And the competition right now is Cleaver. So you have 2 ways of breaking barrier ice, and they both have some pretty strong limitations. Cleaver comes in at 3 strength, which is a bit higher than Marjanah, but boosting its strength is pretty expensive. Now, Marjanah on the other side comes at a very low strength. Boosting it is okay, but breaking subroutines can be very expensive. And there's only 4 barriers within System Gateway right now, and half of them actually have 3 subroutines on them. So for Marjanah, that's the difference between breaking all the subroutines for either 3 credits or 6 credits, disregarding ice boosting strength stuff. That's a really big deal. So if you want to use Marjanah as your breaker, you're really going to value making a cheap run, maybe on archives or R&D earlier in the turn, because that's the difference of 3 credits for a single piece of ice. And this ice is going to consistently show up in System Gateway. There's only so many options each corp has. So the question is, which one looks better? And honestly, they kind of both look a bit difficult based off the ice suite that's put in front of them. Ping is the low strength ice that Marjanah sometimes breaks for 1, Cleaver breaks for 1, so that's kind of fine. Palisade comes in at 2 or 4 strength, and you break Palisade at 2 strength for 1 credit with Cleaver. For Marjanah, it's already 2 to 3 credits, so it doesn't look great. Palisade at 4 strength on remote server, Cleaver's paying 3, and Marjanah is playing 1, 2, 3, 4 to 5, so it's not worse than Cleaver. Sorry, it's not better than Cleaver. It's actually sometimes worse than Cleaver, so already not looking amazing. And on top of that, Pharos and Brawn, it gets really bad. I believe both pay the same amount for Brawn, which is a lot. It's like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 credits for Marjanah if you don't have that run already on the turn. Cleaver's the same 11 credits. I guess Marjanah could bring that down. And Pharos is an absolute nightmare. Pharos at 5 is, well, it's still really expensive. I think Cleaver might be a bit cheaper. What's the math? 2, 4, 5, 6, and Marjanah is 4, 5, 6, 7. So basically, Cleaver's cheaper on everything besides a 5 triple advanced Pharos at 10 strength. Cleaver is just universally going to be cheaper at everything unless you're dealing with a really, really big Pharos. And the cool thing is you don't have to deal with a really big Pharos if you really don't want to. That's where you have things like Botulus. We'll talk about another card real soon that deals with some of that big ice. But the idea is that Marjanah, its strength of Marjanah is that it's really cheap and you can put it down early for pressure. That was something that actually was very relevant in the criminal card pool. I'm talking about outside of Gateway. Is the idea is that you could put down something cheap once you found out there was a barrier on HQ, install this for 0, and then you would quickly throw out some sort of pressure cards. The idea is like, okay, install breaker, doesn't cost a lot, diversion of funds, let's go. And so you don't have to pay a lot of credits to install a breaker. You have this cheap thing you can throw out for hand. But that doesn't really exist in System Gateway. There's not a lot of reasons why you need something quickly to deal with a problem. And even if you do want to do that in System Gateway, you do have access to things like Botulus and also Mayfly that are a bit more universally flexible. And then after that, Marjanah is just worse at dealing with everything than Cleaver 9 out of 10 times. So I feel like I'm not going to be running a lot of Marjanah. I think even in criminal decks, I'm more likely to spend maybe 1 Marjanah, maybe 1 Cleaver, and then you can aggressively like mutual favor for that 1 Cleaver, so you don't have to spend 4 influence. But Marjanah feels really, really expensive, and it doesn't feel very good to play. Even if you install a Marjanah, that's the idea, is like you save 3 credits on the install cost. Like if you have to run through a Palisade remote a couple times, it gets really hard, and it forces you to run central servers to save money. And ideally, you are running central servers anyway, but you don't want to put yourself in a situation where that becomes necessary. Like you still have a lot of things you want to do on your turn, and just running archives to gain a Pennyshaver credit just to save a credit running the remote server isn't amazing. So feels weird. Now, outside of System Gateway, I don't think it's going to see really any play. Like the idea of having something early so you can get that like tempo, quick diversion of funds in the early game, like that is something that you really want to do, but there's so many other ways to do it. Oh, this is meant to be Boomerang, not Boom. The idea is that criminals can quickly put down a Boomerang and just get into HQ if they really need to in a pinch. It doesn't give a really good reason why you'd want a card like this that looks like it's an early aggression card when criminal has access to things like Boomerang or Inside Job. Now, admittedly, cards like this did see a bit play. This was Tycoon that for a while did see play in like competitive decks. And that was because this was played alongside cards like Amakua. And Amakua is a really strong breaker that does need some support. And after a purge, it looks really awkward where you can't get into the remote server if the barriers are at higher strength. So some of these decks actually had a backup Tycoon as a fractor that they were hoping not to use. Tycoon does have actually a pretty big drawback into it, in which it gives the corp credits. So maybe in lists like that, you could consider playing a Marjanah as just like a pocket solution. It also lets you also deal with wraparound, which sometimes is 7 strength if you don't have a fractor installed. And that's the cheapest fractor you can install in the game so that you can Amakua through it. So that seems kind of interesting. I'm really trying to reach to figure out why this would be something you want to pursue in outside of System Gateway. Khan can install this technically for free after you pass a single piece of ice. So you can build some sort of Aesop's pawn shop engine, but that doesn't seem fantastic. Now, one interesting thing too, like where this maybe could see play, and it's actually very similar to an old card that did see play in some competitive decks, and that's Inti. Inti has rotated, but it's a very similar card, very cheap to install, one influence, it comes down. It's actually really bad at dealing with like big barriers, but it's really good at dealing with some of the cheap stuff. This is an old deck from 2015, but the idea is that this deck would play a single Inti. And that's because this deck actually used alternate means. It's very similar to the Amaku example that we talked about to break ice. So this deck would use like Lady to break barriers, but Lady only had so many charges in it, and it only had so much flexibility. So a lot of times that you would play your Inti just so you didn't have to sweat the small stuff. It also worked well with things like Atman, right? Like you could put Atman at bigger numbers, and then any small barriers you could get through with an Inti. And I think that's interesting. And I think there's a chance that Marjanah will see play as a really cheap solution as a fractor, because also like Shapers don't really have good fractors. That might be interesting because there's only one influence. It's very easy to put into a deck. But I think the most important thing is to put this all into perspective. These are the breakers or the fractors that Criminal has access to in the standard card pool. And they're all pretty bad. And that's the point. Criminals are not meant to have good fractors. It's kind of the weakness. Every faction is meant to have one type of ice that they really struggle to deal with. And most of the times, competitively, decks will just spend influence to import a solution to that problem. And almost all criminal decks I've been playing recently will just pay 3 influence for the best fractor in the game. De facto, best fractor in the game. And that's really good. And I think that's also really, really important. We talked about how so much of the criminal card pool revolves around get access, make run, get paid. Not even get access, but just make run, get paid, right? And so ensuring that you have some of the best tools to make those runs cheap really benefits the criminal playstyle. So instead of like struggling where like, oh, I want to run HQ every turn, but now I have to pay 4 credits to get through a barrier, like you might as well pay paperclip and end up paying like 2 credits to get through a barrier. It adds up a lot. So this is Tranquilizer. It is a 2 credit program. It's a virus subtype. It says you only install this on a piece of ice. It can be rezzed or unrezzed. It says when you install this program and when your turn begins, place 1 virus counter on this program. Then if there are 3 or more hosted virus counters, derezzed host ice, it's nap time. 3 influence. This is the second card, which we've already previewed and talked about at length in the video that's hopefully just above my head at this point. And I highly recommend you to check out that video to get my takes on it. I largely, again, I don't think I can go as in depth, unfortunately, now as we did back then, because there's still a lot of stuff to talk about. But everything we said there generally checks out, barring this one cool competitive deck that's actually playing this card, which is really exciting. So when people saw this card, I think a lot of people were really scared about it because it sounds really strong and really oppressive. And it can be really strong and really oppressive. Let's talk about System Gateway. The idea is that as a criminal, you want to make sure that you're always making cheap runs and you have some economic pressure, right? With things like tread lightly. And the idea is that if a criminal, or sorry, if a corporation reses a Pharaohs in front of HQ, heaven forbid they triple advance it, like it's going to be very hard for you to get into HQ to get accesses, right? Like you can't get through a 10 strength ice, and you're definitely not going to do it with a Marjanah. And this is your way of dealing with it. You install a Tranquilizer on this piece of ice, and then in 3 turns, it gets derezzed. And then you can run it, and you can force the corp, or the corp can choose to res it. It will be derezzed immediately on the start of your next turn if the corp doesn't purge. But it is your solution to ensure that the strongest ice, the ice that's very expensive for the corp to res over and over again, looks very unattractive. That's the idea of Tranquilizer. It's important to know that Tranquilizer will only derez a card when it's installed. If it has 3 virus counters on it, which it will be only installed with a single virus counter on it. We'll talk about ways that it might change. Or at the beginning of your turn, it will add a virus counter and then check if there's 3 virus counters. And that's actually like very generous as a card. So the idea is that you install this, it goes to the corp's turn. They can purge if they want, but purging there is useless because they're going to get a virus counter at the beginning of your turn anyways. The start of your turn has 2 virus counters on it, back to the corp. And if the corp purges here, they buy themselves 1 extra turn before, again, it's back to your turn. It has 3, and then the thing is derezzed. And that can be really mean, and it can be really hard to play around. I think one thing that corps will be very often or very keen to do in that situation is over install on their ice. The idea is that there's a Pharaohs in front of HQ with a Tranquilizer on it. They might think, okay, I'm never going to res this Pharaohs, and they'll trash the Pharaohs and install a new piece of ice on that server. And that saves them install costs because the second ice you install in HQ costs a credit, the third costs 2 credits, so on and so forth. But one thing that I pointed out in the video that is hopefully at some point it was above my head is that I would actually recommend you to keep that ice there and just never res it. And the idea is that criminals only have so much MU. And the Tranquilizer is going to continually tax max out their MU, and they don't have a lot of it. So just keeping it there gives you the ability to res the Pharaohs if you really need it mid-run, because you'll res it and the runner will still have to hit it and deal with it if you can afford it. And that can be a problem for them. It forces them to keep their MU on the Tranquilizer. As soon as you trash the ice, the Tranquilizer gets trashed too, and then they destroy the piece of ice. And you don't want to give them that if you don't have to. Yeah, these effects are interesting. They look really strong. They really do. And like Docklands Pass came out in Downfall, and I look at this card and thought like, wow, this is immense. It's a D-res card, and you don't have to do anything besides just like play normal Netrunner. And Docklands actually like really flexible, because you can D-res on encounter. So the idea is the corp can res an expensive ice, and then you can say, oh, I got enough power counters, Docklands, and then it's D-resed. Because you're encountering the ice, the corp can't res. The corp can only res during approach. But Docklands Pass has seen like no standard competitive play. So these effects like seem really strong. Docklands seems way more easy to play in any criminal deck than Tranquilizer, barring obviously you have to deal with the tag. But I'm interested to see right now inside of standard, I think it's really important. Or sorry, inside of startup, it seems really important. Just because you need ways to be able to pull down ice like this. Like you can't deal with the big ice. And if your deck relies on making a lot of runs and making runs cheaply, you need to make sure that those runs can be cheap. And this is your solution to that. But outside of standard, so far, I haven't seen this see play in any competitive criminal decks, just because MU is really tight and slots are really tight. And this card doesn't do anything the turn it's installed. It does something in like 2 or 3 turns. And there's other D-res cards that don't see any play modernly, like cards like Emergency Shutdown. Haven't seen a lot of competitive play in good stuff criminal decks for a really long time. And I find this card to be way more playable than Tranquilizer. Now, the difference with Tranquilizer, obviously, is that it remains, and it gives the corp a huge disincentive of resing the ice or re-resing the ice, while Emergency Shutdown is a one and done. But it's very hard, considering criminals have a lot they need to do, a lot of economy in their deck, and the slot generally doesn't show up too well. It's also worth noting in the standard card pool, Cyberdeck Sandbox is like really common right now, and this gets a purge on score. And on top of that, it incentivizes corporations to run things like Cyberdeck Virus Suite or other cards that purge or even trash viruses. So it's kind of hard to have a Tranquilizer come in and just get incidental value with it. It's also worth knowing that if you do see a lot of these things, people are playing Magnet. It is showing up in some decks and in competitive decks. So Magnet will make your Tranquilizer feel really bad. Now, the one thing I do want to shout out, and this has shown up since that video that we recorded before, is this really wild Hivemind max list. And German players from the NWE play group have put this deck together. And in short, it's a very virus-heavy deck. It trashes itself, and so it gives you free card draw and continually puts viruses in the heap. And then combined with some of the strong cards of things like Cookbook that ensure that your Tranquilizer comes down with 2 virus counters. And then on top of that, you play things like Hivemind that says the virus counters on this are also considered to be on everything else. This deck is in a very, once it's set up, it's very easy for it to, at instant speed, simulchip in a Tranquilizer on an ice that you've just rezzed. And that Tranquilizer will come in with 2 virus counters because of Cookbook, plus at least 1 virus counter from the Hivemind. So it'll immediately come in with 3 counters and immediately derez the ice. And while Tranquilizer is a 3 influence card, it's really nice in these sort of decks as a 1 of toolbox solution. So if this deck ever runs and the corp spends 8 credits on a Anansi, at instant speed, you can derez it. And instant speed is a really important thing because it gives the corp no window to purge virus counters, whether it be through a Cyberdeck Sandbox or Cyberdeck Virus Suite, because it's mid-run, and even that there's just no window for you to interact with that. So it's proving to be really strong, and specifically that deck alone we've seen so far. But I'm really excited to put together like that D-Res deck that we always talk about on this channel as existing, with things like Rubicon Switch and Tranquilizer and Leave No Trace, and see what kind of pressure we can put onto the corp. But I don't have the highest hopes for it. But that's Tranquilizer. I think in System Gateway, it's really cool. It's your way to deal with big ice. In Standard, I don't know if it's going to see playing a lot of the good stuff. It just feels a bit too slow, and MU is something that criminals struggle with. They actually don't have any criminal cards within faction that give MU, barring consoles. So it's a real cost associated with it. And the fact that it doesn't do anything for 2 turns can be a bummer. This is the last card we talked about in that video, and this is Red Team. It's a 5 cost resource. It's a job subtype. So as McCaffrey, you can save your credit. When you install this resource, load 12 credits onto it. When it's empty, trash it. It's important to know when it says load, those are not from your credit pool, those come from the bank. You can spend a click to run the central server. You have not run this turn. If successful, take 3 credits from this resource. The domes of Heinlein are a pressure cooker of cutthroat capitalism. Prospective employers rarely have time for background checks to influence. So this is another card we talked about before. I'm going to keep this one brief because I don't think my opinions have changed. I'd recommend you to watch that video. I think the one thing I've changed since then is me noticing how closely that this figure here looks like Duke Nukem. Like literally a Duke Nukem cosplay. This has a reprint or reimagining of one of the strongest cards in Netrunner. This was Temujin Contract. A card that when installed loaded 20 credits on it and you could empty it so quickly and is currently banned. And this is the way of them reprinting a card that gives you reasons to run multiple servers. It gives you 3 credits every time you make a successful run on those servers. And it's quite something. We've talked about so many times in this review series of the criminal stuff so far, is one of the best things you can do is just hammer central servers, force the corp to res, get your accesses, get your value. And this fits so perfectly into that strategy. An early red team, an early Pennyshaver, combine that with Zahya's ability. Now you run HQ, you make 3 credits from this, 1 from Zahya, 1 from Pennyshaver. That's immense. That is so much money. And it really incentivizes the corp to slow down and ice centrals and spend money on resing ice on centrals, which means if they're doing that, they're not scoring in a remote server. And that can be quite something. It's, we talked about this before, that this is kind of like a, 4 dirty laundries. But I think one of the biggest difference between this card and dirty laundry is that there's no real opportunity cost of hitting red team. One of the problems with dirty laundry is you don't get paid if the run is not considered successful. And that's what I love about red team, is you can install it early, and mind you, 5 credits is a lot. You can always run archives for 3 credits to get some of the money back, but running archives just for 3 credits isn't amazing. You generally want to pair this with getting a real access. But the big difference between this and dirty laundry is that if the run isn't successful, you don't lose the red team credits. You lose nothing, barring the fact that you can't rerun that server to get the red team this turn. So it's amazing. It gives the corp a real good reason to res everything. Even if they don't want to res R&D, now it's like, oh, they not only do they get an access, they gain 4 credits with Zahya and red team. That's really good. And it's a card that works perfectly in the card pool in terms of like get paid, make run, get paid. And it works with all the unsuccessful run event stuff like Leech and Pennyshaver and all that good stuff. And mutual favor, right? Like it's so good altogether. Now outside of Gateway, this gets so much more playable with Career Fair because you do want to play this early most of the time. It's still really good in the mid to late game because at that point, it's not like you gaining money. But the idea is that your next 4 runs on HQ are 3 credits cheaper, which can be a really big deal if you want to consistently run HQ for Steve Cambridge once a turn. Like that seems really nice to me. So you can get that down on the table. But I think a big thing about this is that's 2 influence and you can play it anywhere else. Because right now, if you play like Shaper specifically, they don't have a lot of pressure cards on HQ. They don't have a good reason to run HQ. And so a lot of times against Tau, also specifically Tau, you don't want to ice up to HQ very heavily, if at all, because if you put ice on HQ, it probably won't be your best ice. And then eventually Tau will remove your best ice from R&D or the remote server to HQ. So I love playing cards like Red Team and Tau, whether it's in System Gateway or outside of it, just to have some card that incentivizes the corp for icing HQ and R&D. And then if you want to poke HQ, which isn't something a lot of the cards in Shaper interact with, well, there's not a lot of cards in Shaper that say like run HQ, get additional value. This helps you get those accesses while also making money at the same time. And I feel like there's so many Shapers that could play this. Smoke might just like this. Again, she can make some really cheap runs at least once a turn, and that you basically can convert those stealth credits that she gets for free into red team credits. Those are real credits. And on top of that, Alice Merchant is an anarch that puts pressure on every central server. Archives she puts pressure on in the early game. And if she's trashing cards from archives, that means there's more likely to be agendas in HQ in like fewer cards because they had to throw stuff out. So it's really good to get a red team early and then just start running into stuff. It feels good. Again, for the full thoughts, check out the video, but this is a card in also, it is worth noting that so far in standard play, this hasn't seen a lot of play in competitive criminal decks. And again, slots are pretty hard. I do want to do a bit more testing with it because I feel like any deck with 3 career fairs that wants to run aggressively, this does feel better than it might look. I think a lot of people look at this and look at the click efficiency of it, think like, oh, it's 4 clicks or 5 clicks to get, 7 credits. That doesn't sound good. But I think a bigger deal with this is it's not just an econ card. It's an econ card attached to accesses. It's an econ card attached to the thing you want to do anyways. So the click cost of using this card doesn't have to be considered because you're going to be making runs on R&D and HQ anyways. And that makes this a lot stronger looking. I want to play more with this because it's a really fun card too. And if I'm not mistaken, those are 9 criminal cards. We have, I think, 3 more neutrals we're going to go over today. Again, apologies we went through some of these quickly because we've talked about them a bit before at length on this channel. But I'm actually a really big fan of these criminal cards in System Gateway because they all incentivize, they all work together. Like most things in System Gateway, they work together really, really well. You have so many good reasons to be aggressive and run. Mutual favor gets you there. Tread lightly is that economic pressure to slow the game down. If you force the corp to res ice on central servers, that gets really strong in remotes. You got that multi-axis with Zahya, that HQ pressure. Pennyshaver pays you. Marjanah is pretty rubbish, but you probably play cleavers anyways, and Carmen's pretty solid. And then you have Trank for big ice and red team for extra pressure. Like, it all works really well together. And a lot of these cards you will splash out of faction System Gateway because these cards are very playable in any deck. Unlike some of the Anarch stuff, which might be a bit more situational, this stuff is always good. Any deck could play Mutual Favor. Every deck should play Docklands Pass and Gateway. The consoles are all very good. Carmen will see play, or red team could see play in every ID. I think that's fantastic. Now, I do have these points that I always judge criminal cards on this channel against, and there's 2 things that are also very criminal that I didn't talk at the beginning, and that is how much these criminal cards feel like crimes to me. We've had a problem, I think, I would say, at least in the old criminal cards the last couple of years, is that it never felt like anything you were doing was wildly illegal compared to like the old unregistered S&W in which you threatened to murder someone. And I think we're getting close to there. Like, Pennyshaver is a real crime. Mutual favor, Docklands Pass. It does feel like you're doing something sneaky, which I like. Duke Nukem is Duke Nukem a lawman? So it's not bad. It's not bad. I really want to see more hostages and more like what's it called? Social engineering stuff like that. And another thing that also we didn't talk about, but is one of my favorite things in Criminal, is that the criminal cards more than ever show physicality. And maybe it's not this card so much, and it's more the core set original art of it. This is Boris hacking into a corporation from the bathroom. He's literally sitting on a toilet. And a lot of the criminal cards actually showed people doing the physical legwork, going to things, breaking into places. And it's one of my favorite parts of criminal cards. And we do see it here. Zahya shows up to places. She's physically there. Mutual favor shows it up. I like that a lot. I'm a big fan of that. Those are the criminal cards. We got 3 neutral cards we're going to talk about, and they work really well with the criminal cards. These have been curated, and this is a card we've been talking about a lot today, and it makes a lot of sense in a Zahya deck. It's Jailbreak. A neutral run event. Run HQ or R&D if successful, draw 1 card. When you breach the attacked server, access 1 additional card. There's some flavor text from the Catalyst, who is the neutral runner from System Gateway. And it says, we'll take the access codes from their own prize deck. Privilege escalation through local application of force. Local application of force is such a fun term. This card is really, really quite something. In terms of like having multi-access in System Gateway, it's so important. Maybe I'm using this term too much if you're not familiar with it, but multi-access is the idea of your run seeing multiple cards, and that makes your run so much better. The idea is instead of running R&D this turn, waiting next turn for the corp to draw and running R&D, which will cost you multiple clicks and way more credits, is you can do that all in 1 click. For HQ, it's also a bit different because not only do you draw a card with Jailbreak, but you see 2 cards from HQ, and seeing multiple cards when you run HQ is a lot better because HQ cards are random, and it ensures that you're going to see 2 different cards on 2 consecutive runs on HQ. And it's really important because I don't know what the math is. The numbers that I naively learned, learning Netrunner, was that the runner needs about 17 accesses to have an average chance of stealing 7 points of agendas. Those numbers might be a bit different with the smaller deck sizes of System Gateway, but this is a card that ensures that you get more accesses quite quickly, and it's very playable. And I've put it as a 3 of in every single System Gateway deck because it is the strongest run event for central servers you have. You have Docklands Pass to see HQ, and I'll play 1 of these and play 3 jailbreaks, and I'll play a single conduit and play 3 jailbreaks, and it's quite something. Now, Jailbreak is really easy to play. It gives you a card draw, which is amazing. It did not have to do that. And it also lets you see additional card wherever you run. And there's right now Maker's Eye and there's Legwork, as we've seen before, which are 2 credit events that only target a single server that let you see multiple cards and 3 cards instead of 2. And I find like even if I'm playing Shaper and, well, okay, maybe that's not entirely true all the time, but this is a 2 influence card. So outside of Gateway, if I wanted to put some R&D pressure into my criminal deck, I would way more likely play Jailbreak than Maker's Eye, because not only is it 2 credits cheaper, it's 2 influence cheaper, and you draw a card. right? Like trading that additional access, like that additional access is really valuable, especially when you start talking about things like R&D lock. This is just so much more easily playable in just about every deck. Also, it being neutral means it's huge to play in like Sunny or Apex or any of the mini factions that have only so much influence that they need really strong neutral cards to go pretty far. This is also an interesting thing. Like a lot of decks will play 2 influence for legwork. And I think there's a pretty good argument. Like Shaper decks don't have any HQ pressure. And this is a really old deck, mind you. But the idea is that you could save 4 influence in this list, if modernly, by playing Jailbreaks in the slot and get a bit more card draw. Like that's so cool. It allows you to put HQ pressure or R&D pressure in any deck that doesn't have it inherently. This is Wildcat. We talked about this deck earlier, but this is Crit's Val deck that was the deck list of the week. And this is the sort of deck that I would love to have a card like Jailbreak. It's a deck that doesn't have a lot of multi-access and has a 50 card minimum deck with Val. And so having a card that sees multiple cards and gives you card draws, like it's all the good stuff in one package. It's just such a generous card. I'm finding also against like a lot of the faster HB decks right now is that they don't modernly ice up central servers that well. Things like Precision Design, ASA, they want to go really fast into remote server. So R&D or HQ is open pretty consistently. And it's hard to find time to set up the board and put pressure on. And like, that's what Jailbreak does perfectly. In open R&D is run, draw a card, it replaces itself, and you see 2 off the top. And that's absolutely amazing. Now, the cool thing is also the draw happens mid-run, which is kind of nice. Like that's quite okay. It helps you deal with damage. The idea is that if you're running central servers and you're worried about net damage, like it does help you. It's one of the safer ways to multi-access against like a personal evolution deck, which is, you know, kind of cute. But it just, I don't know, it just feels really good. But the thing that pains me is like I haven't seen this in any standard competitive deck. And I don't know if I'm massively over evaluating this thing. I think I need to do a bit more testing with it, but like it just feels so good on every board state. I think decks are running legwork, and I want to try playing this instead. Of course, you do have access to Docklands Pass, which is still really good. And any deck that wants to be a bit of aggressive, any meta that has R&D open in the early game or HQ open in the early game, this is quite something. Like the card draw is probably my favorite part of it. And then just adding another access on top of it's quite something. Again, we also talked about this, and Zahya is fantastic because she gets the card draw 2 credits and 2 cards, which is so good, but such a strong, flexible card. All right, our next neutral card is Sure Gamble, which I'm honestly kind of surprised we're reviewing to some extent. I definitely, like, we should be thorough and go through everything, but this is the one card that I, to some extent, feels like it doesn't need a review. But I still think there's a lot of things we can talk about Sure Gamble. It's a neutral event. It costs 5, which actually makes it one of the most expensive events in the whole game, but it gains you 9 credits. So basically, you play this and you gain 4 credits. And it has some new flavor text on this Sure Gamble, this printing Sure Gamble. And it says anyone can put in the hours of planning, practice, and preparation, but making it all look like luck takes style. That's really cool flavor. It goes back to like this ongoing story from the original Sure Gamble about how the character here is wearing a hi-fi quantum manipulation ring that allows her, it basically makes it look like you're lucky. That's the idea of the Sure Gamble. We're kind of cheating at cards here and we're making it look lucky. The story continues. This card is good. It is probably the most played runner card of all time since Netrunner started. And I don't even know further than that. This is a reprint. Oh, looks like something went wrong. Excuse me. This is actually a reprint that goes back to original Netrunner. This is Score, which is same idea. It's a runner prep, which is what they used to call events. Cost 5, gain 9. I used to play this as an alt-art for my Sure Gambles and my decks, and I'd yell Score, and it scared Corpse because they thought I got agenda somehow. This is the quintessential economy card, and so much of the economy in Netrunner is just compared to this card. 1 click for 4 credits is kind of the best you can ask for, but there's a lot of things that actually are comparable to this. The first thing to know is that coming in at 5 credits means that you can play it click 1, turn 1. The idea is that you start the game with 5 credits so you can play Sure Gamble off the top, and it's one of the best cards to get in your mulligan because then you're certainly on 9 credits, and that really opens up the amount of things you can play. It's one of the big reasons why Sure Gamble is so good. It also forces you to plan your turn. There's a lot of times where runners will install something and then second click draw and then draw into a Sure Gamble. So it's one of the good reasons why you want to plan your turn because you only have 5 credits for a couple clicks until you start installing things. So plan your first turn, let alone all your turns. That's also a really good understanding of that you need to make money to gain money. And that's so important in the game of Netrunner. As a runner, if you're on very low credits, there's very few things you can do to quickly jump up in economy. That does change a bit in system gateway. But the idea is that if you're on 2 or 3 credits and you have a sure gamble in your hand, you're gonna have to spend a couple turns or a couple clicks going click, click, sure gamble. And that feels pretty bad. So always ensuring that your deck is like lucrative enough or what's it, solvent enough, I guess is the term. There's enough liquidity so that if you draw or you top deck your economy cards from your deck that you're always able to play them is super important. And Sure Gamble kind of sets that standard number at about 5 credits because once the runner's on 5 credits, you know they can suddenly burst up by 4. Now the interesting thing of having a card that gives you 4 credits for a certain click is that seems to be like the break point of when it's considered good. Easy Mark used to be in the card pool. It was 1 click for 3 credits, and it's one of the most playable cards because you can play it on 0. But Easy Mark saw almost no competitive play for a very long time now in Netrunner. Just 3 credits wasn't as good as 4 credits, and this just wasn't worth a card slot. Now, I don't make the rules. Like, that's just kind of what the competitive players have saying, but 4 credits is where things start to get good. And you notice there are a lot of very playable economy cards that give you 3 credits worth of value, but they attach it to something else to give it that sort of sure gamble efficiency. Dirty Laundry only gives you 3 credits, but it gives you 3 credits and an access if you're not playing it to run archives that's empty or something like that. And that a lot of times can be even better than sure gamble. Overclock is a new card that gives you technically a sure gamble with efficiency and a run, but you don't get to keep the credits, which can be quite something. And Bravado, mind you, is a criminal, relatively new econ card that will give you at least 3 credits, more even if you get through more ice, but also gives you an access a lot of the times. Even the run ends, you're okay with this. But it's wild that like the threshold of what economy should be kind of falls off right after sure gamble. Easy Marks on no play, but sure gamble is just good. It's quintessential. I would say, without any research, I'd very confidently say that this is the most common Netrunner card of all time in runner decks. Most runner decks start by building 3 sure gambles and then building the rest of the deck around it, just because having this in your opening hand just opens up your possibilities so heavily. Now, it is worth noting, this is kind of interesting, that there are competitive decks that don't run sure gamble, because there are decks in which this card isn't worth a slot. And Geist decks are kind of interesting. They work a bit different because their economy is tied up to different things. It's very important to get down your, oh, this one is before Tech Trader. Never mind. What is this deck? There are some decks that work a bit differently. I thought this was going to be a Geist deck with Tech Trader. Some of those decks didn't run sure gamble. Or this deck, which is one of my favorites from a Montreal regional here in 2015, was a Haley deck that wanted to install things a lot because Haley's ability works on installation. So we're not playing any events in this deck. Now, again, I'm pretty sure that these decks might just be better with sure gamble, but for most of the times, it is a 3 of in every deck, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. I don't know what it would take for that to change anytime soon. And there's a lot of ways to make this card even a bit more playable if it wasn't already. Prepaid Voice Pad is a neutral card you can put into your deck if you find out you're playing a lot of events. And even if you save 1 or 2 credits a turn off of that sure gamble, that's immense. You're playing 1 click for 6 credits. Feels good. And you have Mystic Miami and Anarch. Again, if you're playing events pretty consistently, it's very easy to get sure gambles into your deck. And you also have Anakam, which makes that sure gamble also draw a card, which feels really good. I don't know. I'm surprised. Like, okay, I'm not surprised. Again, we talked about it. The idea of like reviewing sure gamble seemed a bit strange. It just because it's very, very good. And it's what everything else is compared to. And it just doesn't do much besides give you money. So I hope it's obvious that this thing is really, really strong. It's a lot of times the best thing to beat in your opening hand, barring certain strategies that open up like professional contacts. And even then, you play sure gamble before you play your professional contacts. It's really good. 3 of in every deck, unless you can find a really strong reason for that to be different. Now, the last neutral card we have today is Smartware Distributor. It's another neutral economy card. It costs 0 to play. To install it, it's a resource. It's a connection subtype. As a click, you can play 3 credits on this resource. When your turn begins, you take a credit from this resource. The beauty of 22nd century tech, it still functions after all these decades. You know the build quality is solid. Whoa, okay, so a couple things. Firstly, when it says place 3 credits, that's not from your credit pool. It comes from the bank, so you actually will be gaining money off of this. But if I'm not mistaken, 22nd century tech, Netrunner classically has been very careful of not saying when it takes place. I don't know if they've ever said 22nd century tech, but that being said, this truck might be selling old stuff. So maybe we could even be in the 23rd century. I don't know, but that's actually pretty meaningful. That's the first time we've actually seen a specific date attached to Netrunner. All right, it's a neutral economy. You spend a click to install it, costs you 0. Then you spend another click to load it. And then in 3 turns, you get 3 credits of value. This is actually something we've seen almost directly on a corp card. The NBN asset marked accounts worked identically. It'd have 5 trash cost because it was an asset. You put it down, you res it, you spend a click to put 3 credits on it, and then beginning your turn, you get a credit off of it. And this is the neutral economy card in System Gateway, barring the very, very good Sure Gamble. It's also worth noting, Sure Gamble, mind you, in System Gateway, if you're new to System Gateway, this is the only reprint of a card. All the other cards in System Gateway are unique to System Gateway besides Sure Gamble and Hedge Fund, which is the corpse version of Sure Gamble. So this is the only non-new card. Smartware, mind you, is a new card. And this is like the easy to put in any deck neutral economy card. And it's important to have those in System Gateway just because you don't have that many cards. With only 9 criminal cards, you're definitely going to want to play some neutral cards to give you, well, you need to fill up a 40 card minimum deck. So you're going to be playing some of this neutral stuff. So Smartware is a very slow card, and it is a very click intensive card. So the idea is you have to, a lot of times when you're looking at economy cards in Netrunner, you have to kind of plan out, or you have to look at how many credits it gives you for how many clicks. And a lot of times that's how people value the strength of economy cards in the game. Now, Smartware Distributor is worth knowing is incredibly easy to play. Anybody can play this. It costs 0. You install it, and then you spend a click and you're good to go. Now, the idea is that if you install this and then you click it, 3 turns later, you've spent 2 clicks for 3 credits, which isn't amazing, mind you, because you can always click for credit off of the basic action cards. So you want to be doing something a bit better than that. Now, if you load Smartware Distributor up again, at that point, you've spent 3 clicks to gain 6 credits. At that point, we've doubled our efficiency from clicking for credit. And that's when usually economy cards are decided to be pretty good. And going from that point on, it gets better and better, right? If you want to click it again, you're spending 4 clicks for 9 credits. That's better than a click for 2 credits, and so on and so on. And that looks really good on paper. You compare it to some of the other neutral economy cards that have been in Netrunner, things like Armitage Code Busting. With Armitage Code Busting, even if you empty all of it, you spend 7 clicks for 11 credits, which is actually, did I do that math right? 6 to take off, 1 to install, 12 minus 1 is 11. Yeah, so that's a fair bit worse than the click efficiency on Smartware Distributor. Caddy Jones is also a very comparable card. It also is interesting compared to Smartware because it's an infinite econ card, but it's very easy to use Caddy very inefficiently. If you install Caddy, load Caddy, next turn load Caddy, next turn take Caddy money off of Caddy, you've spent 4 clicks for 4 credits. That's bad. That's what you could have done without installing a card, right? Just the basic ability. And while I'm saying Smartware looks good compared to Armitage Code Busting, a card that was never really considered incredibly competitive, Smartware Distributor is actually a lot worse in a lot of ways. One of the benefits of Armitage Code Busting is that when it comes down, you can empty it pretty quickly if you need to. It's also a card that you can like very quickly weave into your turns. If you need to dump the money off of it kind of quickly because you were setting up for the next turn, you can do it. But Smartware takes a long time to get the money off of it. The idea is that Smartware is the best to install on turn 1, and then still throughout the game, you're going to have to commit a lot of clicks to it. If you install a turn 1, it's something, but if you draw it like 7 or 8 turns into a game that's only going to be like 14 turns long, it's very unlikely for this to pay off. And if you miss a window to fill it up appropriately, you also don't get as much payout. Like it demands a lot of time from you, and it also demands time at certain windows. It is worth noting you can always overload the Smartware Distributor, but then the threat is if the game ends before all the money comes off of Smartware Distributor, you have to some extent wasted your time, unless you've won, I guess. But that's the problem with Smartware Distributors. Like if you want to get 6 credits off of it, you're going to have to wait 7 turns, and that's a long time. And you really need to get this down early. And at the point, you're spending a lot of clicks on this. On turn 1, installing a Smartware and then clicking it, that's to the point in the game where if you're playing criminal, you want to get a lot of pokes, you want to draw, you want to install your breakers. Like it's asking a lot of you, half your turn on a time where you don't probably have the time to set up drip economy. That's unfortunate. Specifically also within System Gateway, there's a lot of cards like VRcation, and this is something I quite like. You see things like VRcation, Creative Commission. Also, we can compare this card to Telework Contract in some way, but there are a lot of cards that are very click intensive and require you to plan your turn in a certain way. You want to hit your Telework. You want to make sure last click you can VRcation. So you're planning half your turn. If you want to run at some point, like it gets hard to kind of weave in the Smartware Distributors from time to certain points in time. So the fact that this does pay off technically well compared clicks to credits, but it is pretty slow. You need to get early, and it is it's kind of demanding your clicks, makes this kind of hard to play. I think the biggest thing is like, okay, let me rephrase this. In System Gateway, you will play this because in System Gateway, there's not that much economy. That being said, I think there's a lot of situations in System Gateway where it's closer to the end of the game, where if you draw a Smartware Distributor, you don't want to play it because you know the game is going to be over before this will be paying out better than just clicking for credits. On top of that, in the early game, I think there's a couple turns where you don't want to install this early because you don't have the clicks to set up when you're worried that the corp is going to rush out an early agenda with seamless launch behind a palisade. So even then, it can be hard to play. That being said, you only have so much economy in System Gateway that this is likely to see a slot just because you need to play enough things. Now, outside of System Gateway, things look a lot less flattering. And that's because you have a lot more options, and almost all the options you can compare this to that it does directly compare to are a lot better than it. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Like this is meant to be a very easy to play, neutral, zero cost card that goes into any deck. It's not going to be the most powerful thing, right? It trades off maybe its power level for its approachability. So let's compare this to Rizeki. And Rizeki is very easy to play. It does take up 1 MU, which is a real cost, but otherwise only costs 2 credits and a single influence. And it simply says when your turn begins, gain a credit. Now, if we compare that to things like Smartware Distributor, the best times to look at the efficiency of Smartware Distributor is on every 4th, 7th, 10th turn, right? Stuff like that. If we look at turn 7 with Smartware Distributor, you spent 3 clicks to make 6 credits. But if we look at turn 7 with Rizeki, we've made, what is the math? 7 minus 6, 5. We've spent 1 click to make 5 credits. And that's the idea. Like Rizeki, you do pay the upfront cost. That's for sure. You are paying a premium, but at that point, you're not paying any more clicks. And so as the game goes longer and longer, this card becomes so much more efficient than Smartware Distributor. Fire and forget, install, turn 1, and throughout the game, it'll probably make you 10, 12 credits. Admittedly, it does run into the same problem where if you draw it into the mid game to late game, it might not be worth installing, but at least this is way more installable in the mid game because you can install it. And even if it gives you 1 credit, 2 credits, you don't spend a lot of clicks on it, unlike sometimes the Smartware Distributor. Other cards like Data Folding, again, this has a build around, but it's the same idea. It's 1 credit more expensive than Rizeki, and it just gives you a credit a turn. You don't have to worry about clicks. I think some of the easier things are Paladin Puemo. This is a really good card. Shows up as a 2 of, sometimes a 3 of in all competitive Anarch decks. You install this and it gives you at least 1 credit a turn to install things. It's not credit in your credit pool, so you can't use it for pumping icebreakers or tracing or any stuff like that. But it just gives you 1 credit a turn clicklessly, and that's really, really good. And even have things like prepaid voice pad, which again doesn't give you legitimate money in your credit pool, but it gives you 1 credit worth of value a turn without spending any clicks. And I think that's a big thing about Smartware Distributor is that it's so click intensive. And right now, competitively, the game is just too fast for this. There's a lot of games that I think on average games are 12 to 15 turns. So you really need to get this early. And in the early game, some of those decks are really explosive. You can't spend 2 clicks setting this up, where a lot of those decks could just install a Rizeki and then forget about it and then still make 11 credits throughout the game. That's fine. It doesn't need to be a good card. Again, in Gateway, you're excited to play it. That being said, I think you should be a bit more discerning when to play this or not. I feel like a lot of times if you're not set up to deal with the corporation, it's probably better just to get other things down on the table and maybe throw this one out. Those are all the criminal cards and 3 neutral cards that I wanted to talk about today. Again, I'm a big fan of the criminal cards. I just love teaching Netrunner when it comes to criminal. The idea that I can say oh, this is criminal. Go get some accesses, force some ice reses, be scared of nothing, get some runs, see a lot of things, get paid at the same time. It's just such a good feeling. And it really brings people into the running side of Netrunner. It's really easy to sit down behind a corp that puts face down ice and be scared of it. And I love that Zahya really encourages you, Red Team really encourages you to say, whatever, what's the worst it can be? And in System Gateway, it can't be that bad. And it's designed in that way, which is really quite good. There's a lot of cards here. If there's certain combinations or things that you're excited to build or play that I've missed, I would love to hear what those are in the comments. I do read all that stuff and respond to as much as I can. But that's largely it for these blue criminal cards. We'll be back in hopefully a week or so with the NBN stuff. Again, we're about halfway through this series. Again, if you do like this sort of content, if you want to leave a like on this video or subscribe to the channel, it does really help the Metropolitan Grid grow. And we do stream Thursday nights at 8:45 Eastern. Hopefully sometime soon we'll be testing out these criminal cards. I want to play a D-Res deck with some Tranquilizers and some Rubicon, play some Los or what have you. But that's largely it. We'll see you in a week.